Let's settle in for a story tonight. It's a story about something so famous we think we know it. We see it in pictures, a magnificent stone dragon sleeping on the mountains. But its real story is much darker and far more human than the legend we're all told. The Great Wall of China. It's an icon of human achievement, a symbol of strength and endurance that has stood for centuries. We imagine it as a single, majestic barrier, a clear line drawn across the landscape by a powerful emperor to protect his people from the outside world. But that beautiful image is a fantasy. The reality was a sprawling, brutal project that consumed generations. It was a task so demanding it would break most of us before the first week was over. It wasn't just a wall. For many, it was the end of the line. So find a comfortable spot and dim the lights. Let the noise of the day fade away completely. We are going to travel back in time to uncover the truth buried in the earth and stone. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, starting with the first great myth. The first secret is that there is no the Great Wall. That's right, the single, unbroken structure you see in your mind doesn't actually exist. It was never one continuous project. That idea is a modern invention, a convenient simplification of a much messier, more complicated truth. Instead, picture a vast collection of walls. Think of it more like a scrapbook of defensive projects. Different dynasties, separated by hundreds of years, built their own sections. Many of these walls don't even connect. Some are hundreds of miles apart, built for entirely different reasons. Many of these earlier sections weren't even made of stone. They were hastily built barriers of packed earth, wood, and gravel. They were functional, ugly, and designed to crumble. The majestic brick and stone version we picture is mostly the work of one much later dynasty, the Ming. So the idea of one emperor ordering one great wall is a fiction. It's more like a series of desperate attempts by different rulers to control a wild and dangerous frontier. Each section tells the story of a different time, a different fear, and a different emperor's ambition. Let's go back to the very beginning, to the man who gets all the credit. His name was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a truly unified China. He is often painted as a great visionary, the father of the wall. But his vision was built on a foundation of terror. Before him, China was a collection of warring states. Each had built small defensive walls to protect against its neighbors. When Qin Shi Huang conquered them all, he had a new problem. He needed to protect his new empire not just from outside threats, but from his own people. He ordered the northern walls of the states he conquered to be connected. This was the first attempt at a unified Great Wall. But his motivation was as much about control as it was about defense. A wall keeps people out, but it also keeps people in, and it defines your territory. His new empire was fragile, and he ruled it with an iron fist. His philosophy was simple: the state is everything, and the individual is nothing. The wall became the ultimate symbol of this belief, a massive state project that would be built with the lives of his subjects. The people who built this first wall were not skilled artisans or proud volunteers. They were soldiers, peasants, and a huge number of convicts. He emptied his prisons and sent them to the frontier. For many, it was a death sentence, a way to build his monument with disposable people. Imagine being a farmer, pulled from your land and your family. You are marched for hundreds of miles to a barren, freezing landscape. You're handed crude tools and told to build a wall until it's finished, or until you die. There was no going home for these first workers. The scale of the project was unlike anything seen before. The logistics were a nightmare. Supplying hundreds of thousands of workers with food, water, and materials in such a remote area was nearly impossible. Starvation and disease were as deadly as the harsh working conditions themselves. The legend says that for every foot of the wall that was built, one person lost their life. While that might be an exaggeration, the truth is not far off. The wall quickly became known as the longest cemetery on Earth. The dead were often buried right in the foundations. This dark legacy began with Qin Shi Huang. His section of the wall was not the stone masterpiece we know. It was made of tamped earth. Workers would build a wooden frame, fill it with earth, and pound it down until it was as hard as rock, layer by layer. The work was mind-numbing and body-breaking. Day after day, under the watch of brutal guards, the men hauled dirt and pounded the earth. There were no safety measures, no days off. An injury or a moment of weakness could mean being left to die in the wilderness. But if the first emperor's wall was built on cruelty, what about the men who were sent to guard it? Life for a soldier on the wall was not a noble calling. It was a grim, lonely, and incredibly boring existence, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. These guards were stationed in watchtowers, often miles from the nearest settlement. They were isolated for months, sometimes years at a time. Their job was to watch the empty horizon, waiting for a signal of smoke or fire from the next tower, signaling an attack. The enemy they feared was not a giant invading army, at least not at first. They were nomadic tribes from the northern steppes. These groups, like the Xiongnu, were masters of cavalry. They didn't want to conquer China. They wanted to raid its resources and then disappear. The wall was not a perfect barrier against these swift horsemen. It was more of a tripwire. Its main purpose was to slow down raiders and prevent them from bringing back stolen goods easily. The watchtowers were an alarm system, meant to give the real army time to respond. But for the lone guard, this was little comfort. He was the first line of defense. If a small raiding party decided to test his section of the wall, he was on his own. Help was often too far away to matter. Many soldiers simply vanished, their posts found empty. The weather was a constant enemy. In winter, the winds were so cold they could freeze a man solid. In summer, the heat was unbearable, and water was scarce. Supplies were inconsistent, and the soldiers often had to survive on meager, rotting rations for long periods. Corruption was also a problem. Commanders far away would often steal the soldiers, pay or sell their supplies on the black market. The men on the front line were left to fend for themselves, ill-equipped and demoralized. It was a miserable and thankless job. And here is a crucial secret. The wall often failed. For all the lives and resources poured into it, it was frequently breached. Clever invaders didn't try to knock it down. They would simply find an unguarded section or go around the end of it entirely. The most effective way to get past the wall, however, was much simpler: bribery. A few coins could persuade a lonely, underpaid, and miserable guard to simply open a gate and look the other way while a raiding party slipped through. It happened more often than the emperors knew. Generations passed, and dynasties rose and fell. The original wall of Qin Shi Huang crumbled back into the earth it came from. For centuries, the idea of a single great wall was largely abandoned. Rulers focused on other forms of defense, like diplomacy or offensive military campaigns. Then came the Ming Dynasty in the 14th century. They were the ones who became truly obsessed with wall building. Their obsession was born from a deep sense of national humiliation. They were determined to never let foreign invaders control China again, as the Mongols had. The Ming emperors decided to build a wall that would be stronger, taller, and more permanent than any before it. This is the wall we see today. They used advanced technology for their time: bricks fired in kilns and a strong mortar made from sticky rice and lime. This new wall was an engineering marvel, but the human cost remained just as high. The Ming Dynasty mobilized a massive workforce, repeating the same cruel pattern of conscription that had been used over 1,000 years earlier. The cycle of suffering began all over again. The builders faced new dangers. The Ming Wall was built across treacherous mountain ridges. Men had to carry heavy bricks and stones up steep, narrow paths. A single misstep could send a man plummeting to his death. The work was slow, expensive, and incredibly dangerous. Entire villages were emptied of their able-bodied men to work on the wall. The fields were left untended, and families starved. The wall became a source of deep resentment among the common people, who saw it as a monstrous project that devoured their sons and husbands. Let's zoom in on the life of one of these builders. Imagine his name is Chen. He's a farmer with a small family. One day, the emperor's officials arrive in his village. His name is on a list. He is told he must serve his duty to the empire by working on the wall. He has no choice. Saying no means being branded a traitor, which would lead to the punishment of his entire family. So he says a tearful goodbye, not knowing if he will ever see his home again. He joins a long column of men marching north into the unknown. The work is harder than anything he has ever imagined. His hands, used to soil, are soon raw and bleeding from handling the rough stones. The foreman is a harsh man who uses a whip to enforce discipline. The food is thin soup and hard bread, never enough. He sleeps on the hard ground with dozens of other men, shivering in the cold mountain air. He hears stories of men who have fallen from the scaffolding, of those who have succumbed to sickness, their bodies tossed into a common grave without ceremony. Fear is a constant companion. One day, his crew is tasked with mixing the legendary mortar. The recipe is a state secret, a mixture of lime and sticky rice flour. The rice, a precious food source, is being used for construction, while the workers themselves are slowly starving. The irony is not lost on him. This sticky rice mortar was incredibly effective. It bound the bricks together so tightly that in many places, weeds still cannot grow between them. It created a wall that was stronger than stone, a testament to Ming ingenuity. But it came at a terrible price. Chen watches as bags of rice that could feed his village for a month are poured into the mixing pits. He thinks of his family and wonders if they have enough to eat. The wall, meant to protect the empire, is being built by destroying the very people it claims to defend. Even with this super strong wall, the old problems remained. The sheer length of it made it impossible to man completely. There were always weak points, gaps in the defense that a determined enemy could exploit. The Ming were building a perfect fortress that was too big to guard. This brings us to the wall's greatest failure and one of history's great ironies. In the 17th century, the Ming dynasty was collapsing from internal rebellion. An invading force, the Manchus, was gathered at the border, ready to take advantage of the chaos. The Manchus did not have to break down the wall. They did not have to find a secret passage. A Ming general, feeling betrayed by his own emperor, made a fateful decision. He simply opened the gates at a key pass and let the entire Manchu army walk right through. In the end, the greatest wall ever built was defeated not by an army, but by a single act of betrayal. All the suffering, all the death, all the resources poured into its construction were made meaningless in an instant. The wall had failed its ultimate test. After the Manchus took over and established the Qing dynasty, the wall lost its military purpose. The new empire expanded far beyond the wall, making it obsolete. It was no longer a frontier. It was now deep inside their own territory. The great project was finally abandoned. For the next few centuries, the wall was neglected. Locals stole bricks from it to build their own houses and farms. Nature began to reclaim it, with plants and trees growing over the crumbling stone. The great dragon fell into a long, quiet sleep across the mountains. It was only in the 20th century that the wall was reborn, this time as a symbol. It became a powerful icon of Chinese nationalism and endurance. The dark history of its construction was glossed over in favor of a more heroic, romantic narrative of unity and strength. And that brings us to the final myth, the one you may have heard in school, that the Great Wall of China is the only man-made object visible from the moon. This is completely, unequivocally false. It's a modern legend with no basis in reality whatsoever. Astronauts have repeatedly confirmed you cannot see it from orbit, let alone the moon. The wall, while very long, is actually quite thin. Seeing it from space would be like trying to see a single human hair from 2 miles away. It's simply impossible. This myth, like the idea of a single continuous wall, serves a purpose. It elevates the structure from a complex, messy, and often tragic historical reality into something purely legendary. It makes for a better story, but it hides the truth of the millions of forgotten lives that were sacrificed. Let's talk more about those forgotten lives. While emperors and generals wrote the official histories, the common people told their own stories in whispers. These were folk tales passed down through generations that captured the true emotional cost of the wall. The most famous of these is the story of a woman named Meng Jiangnu. Her tale is a powerful counter-narrative, a story of love and grief so immense that it was said to have physically broken the emperor's great monument. It's a story that reminds us that for every stone laid by the state, there was a human heart that was broken. Her legend became a quiet, powerful form of protest, a way for the powerless to remember the true price of the wall when the official records only spoke of imperial glory and strategic defense. It's not a story about an army or a battle, but about one woman's refusal to let her husband become just another nameless body buried in the foundation. The story begins not at the wall, but in a quiet garden. Meng Jiangnu was newly married to a scholar named Fan Qiliang. Their life was supposed to be one of peace, poetry, and simple happiness. They were in love, and the world outside their small home seemed distant and unimportant. According to the legend, their meeting itself was a charming accident, involving Fan Qiliang hiding from officials in her family's garden. Their marriage was a promise of a future, a small, perfect world they would build together. This idyllic beginning is crucial to the story because it represents everything the wall was built to destroy: individual happiness, personal dreams, and the simple life of ordinary people. They were not political figures or warriors. They were just two people who wanted to be left alone to live their lives, a wish that the emperor's grand ambition would soon make impossible. Their peaceful existence was shattered just 3 days after their wedding. Officials from the Qin emperor's court arrived, scouring the country for able-bodied men to send to the northern frontier. Fan Qiliang, despite being a scholar and not a laborer, was conscripted. He was torn from his new wife's arms, given no time for proper goodbyes, and chained together with other unfortunate men. He was now the property of the state, his future dictated by the emperor's will. This moment captures the brutal reality for millions of families. There was no appeal, no negotiation. The needs of the massive state project overruled any personal attachments or individual rights. For Meng Jiangnu, the love of her life vanished into the machinery of the empire, sent to a place from which few men ever returned. Her perfect world had been broken by the cold, impersonal demands of the wall. Months turned into a season, and then a year, with no word from her husband. As winter approached, Meng Jiangnu was consumed with worry. She imagined him in the freezing north, laboring in the bitter cold, with only thin clothes to wear. She couldn't bear the thought of his suffering. So she made a decision that was both brave and desperate. She packed a bundle with warm, padded clothes she had made for him, and she set off on a journey to find him. It was an almost suicidal mission for a woman to travel alone across ancient China. The journey would be thousands of miles long, crossing treacherous mountains and dangerous rivers, but her love was stronger than her fear. She was determined to find him, to bring him a small piece of warmth and comfort from the home that had been stolen from them. Her journey was a grueling ordeal. She walked until her feet were raw, sleeping in the open wilderness or relying on the kindness of strangers. She faced bandits, wild animals, and the constant threat of starvation. The landscape was vast and unforgiving, a physical representation of the state's immense and indifferent power. Each mountain she climbed, and each river she crossed was a testament to her incredible will. This part of the legend emphasizes her personal sacrifice, mirroring the forced sacrifice of the men who built the wall. She was not a conscript, but she endured the same hardships, driven by a personal mission that stood in stark contrast to the emperor's impersonal ambition. Her small human figure, moving through that immense, harsh landscape, is a powerful image of love against overwhelming odds. She was one person against an empire, armed with nothing but devotion. After months of travel, she finally reached the Great Wall. But what she found was not a single, easily navigated structure. It was a chaotic, sprawling construction site stretching as far as the eye could see, crawling with tens of thousands of workers who all looked the same in their ragged clothes. It was a place of noise, dust, and despair. Her heart sank. How could she possibly find one man in this endless sea of suffering? The wall was not a monument of glory. It was a monstrous, soul-crushing machine. It was a symbol of the very power that had taken her husband, and its sheer scale felt like a deliberate insult to her personal, singular love. The wall was a testament to the idea that individuals did not matter, and now she had to find the one individual who mattered most to her in the heart of that beast. She began her desperate search, walking along the base of the wall for days, which turned into weeks. She showed the workers a piece of her husband's clothing. She spoke his name until her voice was hoarse. She asked every guard, every foreman, every exhausted laborer she met. Some ignored her, too broken by their own misery to help. Others looked at her with pity, knowing the likely truth. A few tried to help, but no one had heard of a scholar named Fan Kiliang. The name meant nothing here. He was just another face, another pair of hands that had been swallowed by the project. The hope that had sustained her throughout her long journey began to crumble, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The wall was a place where names were forgotten and identities were erased. Her husband had become one of the nameless. Finally, she found an old man who recognized the name. He looked at her with sad eyes and confirmed her worst fear. Her husband, unaccustomed to the harsh physical labor, had died from exhaustion months ago. The foreman, not wanting to waste time on a proper burial, had ordered his body to be interred directly into the wall itself, to become part of the foundation. He was just one of thousands, the old man said, whose bones were mixed in with the earth and stone. This was the ultimate horror. The wall hadn't just taken his life, it had consumed his very body. It was his tomb, a massive, unmarked grave from which she could never retrieve him. The structure was no longer just a wall. It was a monument built from the remains of the man she loved. Upon hearing this news, Meng Jiangnu collapsed at the foot of the wall, and her grief, which she had held back for so long, erupted. She began to weep, her cries filled with all the pain of her lost love and her pointless journey. She wept for days, her sorrow so profound that the legend says the heavens themselves took notice. A storm gathered, the sky grew dark, and a freezing wind howled. And then, the impossible happened. The section of the wall where her husband was buried began to tremble and crack. Her weeping, a force of pure human emotion, caused over 20 miles of the emperor's Great Wall to collapse, revealing the bones and bodies of the workers buried within. Among them, she found the remains of her beloved Fan Kiliang. Her personal grief had literally broken the symbol of state power. The story doesn't end there. The collapse of the wall brought the incident to the attention of the emperor himself. He was furious and ordered the woman to be brought before him for punishment. But when he saw Meng Jiangnu, he was struck by her beauty and spirit. Instead of punishing her, he offered to make her one of his concubines. For Meng Jiangnu, this was the final insult. To be forced into the arms of the man responsible for her husband's death was a fate worse than any punishment. She agreed, but only on 3 conditions: that her husband be given a grand funeral, that the emperor and his court attend, and that a high platform be built by the river. The emperor, infatuated, agreed. After the funeral, she climbed the platform, cursed the emperor for his cruelty, and then threw herself into the river to join her husband in death. The legend of Mengjiangnu endured for thousands of years because it captured a fundamental truth about the Great Wall. It was a story that acknowledged the immense suffering that the official histories ignored. Her defiance, first in her journey, then in her grief, and finally in her death, became a powerful symbol of the individual spirit fighting back against an oppressive state. Shrines were built in her honor along parts of the wall, and her story was told and retold in poems, songs, and operas. She gave a face and a name to the countless nameless victims who were sacrificed for the emperor's ambition. While the wall was a monument to imperial power, her story became a monument to human love and the unbearable cost of such grand projects. It was a reminder that no structure, no matter how great, is worth the price of human happiness. Let's transition from the world of legend back to the hard, physical reality of the wall. Beyond the human cost, there was an enormous environmental price to be paid. To build the Ming-era wall, the one made of stone and brick, required a staggering amount of resources. The most important of these were fuel for the kilns that fired the millions upon millions of bricks. For every section of the wall that was built, the surrounding hills and mountains were systematically stripped of their trees. Entire forests were cut down to feed the fires, leading to massive deforestation. This had devastating long-term consequences. Without the trees to hold the soil in place, erosion became a major problem, leading to landslides and turning once fertile areas into barren wastelands. The wall didn't just create a barrier for people. It created a dead zone in the landscape around it. This environmental destruction created a vicious cycle. As the forests near the construction sites were depleted, workers had to travel farther and farther to find wood, which slowed down construction and increased the cost. The smoke from the countless kilns filled the air, creating a permanent haze that choked the valleys. The construction of the wall was, in essence, a slow-motion environmental catastrophe. The project that was meant to protect the heartland of China was actively poisoning the land along its most important frontier. This is a secret of the wall that is rarely discussed. We see the finished product, the stone dragon on the green hills, but we don't see the ghost of the forests that were sacrificed to create it, or the scarred land that was left behind in its wake. The construction also had a profound impact on local wildlife. The wall cut directly through animal migration routes that had existed for thousands of years. Herds of animals that once roamed freely were now blocked by this impassable barrier. This disrupted the delicate balance of the ecosystem, leading to the decline of certain species in the area. The wall was not just a defensive line against human invaders. It was an indiscriminate barrier that reshaped the natural world around it. It created an artificial divide that the local fauna could not overcome. For the animals of the region, the Great Wall was an incomprehensible and permanent obstacle, a scar on their world that altered their very existence, a consequence that the builders and planners almost certainly never even considered. But the wall didn't just consume resources, it also created its own strange economy. A vast support system was needed to keep the hundreds of thousands of soldiers and workers alive. This led to the rise of wall towns, settlements that sprang up near major garrisons and construction sites. These towns were a mixture of military outposts and rough-and-tumble frontier boomtowns. They were filled with merchants, smugglers, laborers, and entertainers, all trying to make a living off the massive state project. Life in these towns was often grim and dangerous, but they were also places of opportunity for those willing to risk it. They became the logistical hubs that funneled supplies, information, and people to and from the wall, creating a whole new society that existed solely because of the barrier. This wall economy was rife with corruption. The project was so massive and the supply lines so long that it was easy for officials to skim off the top. Grain meant for soldiers would be sold on the black market. Funds allocated for building materials would disappear into the pockets of commanders. Soldiers were often forced to farm their own food on small plots of land because their promised rations never arrived. This systemic corruption weakened the wall's defenses from the inside. While the structure itself might have been strong, the morale of the men tasked with defending it was often rock bottom. They were underpaid, undersupplied, and knew that the officials above them were getting rich off their misery. This created a deep sense of cynicism that made bribery, as we discussed earlier, an even more tempting option. Now let's shift our perspective entirely. We've talked about the Chinese emperors, builders, and soldiers, but what about the people on the other side of the wall? The nomadic tribes of the steppes, who were labeled as barbarians by the Chinese court. For them, the wall was not a symbol of protection. It was a profound and aggressive statement of exclusion. For centuries, the relationship between the agricultural Chinese and the pastoral nomads was complex. It wasn't just constant warfare. There was also extensive trade and cultural exchange. The nomads provided horses, a crucial military asset, while the Chinese provided grain, silk, and metal goods. The wall was a deliberate attempt to sever this connection, to create a hard border where a fluid zone of interaction once existed. From the perspective of a tribe like the Xiongnu, or later the Mongols, the wall was a declaration of hostility. It cut them off from traditional grazing lands, and, more importantly, from the lucrative trade opportunities to the south. The raids that the wall was built to prevent were often not acts of mindless aggression, but economic necessities. When trade was cut off, raiding was one of the few ways for the tribes to acquire the goods they needed to survive. In a way, the wall itself often provoked the very attacks it was meant to deter. It turned potential trading partners into permanent enemies by building a massive, undeniable symbol of mistrust and separation right on their doorstep. It was a physical manifestation of the Chinese worldview that saw everything outside its borders as uncivilized and threatening. Furthermore, the nomads, particularly the Mongols, were some of the most brilliant military minds in history. They looked at the wall not with fear, but as a challenge to be overcome. The idea of a static defense was completely alien to their way of fighting, which was based on speed, mobility, and surprise. The wall was a big, slow, predictable target. Mongol leaders like Genghis Khan and his successors saw it as an expensive folly. They knew its weaknesses intimately. They knew it was too long to be fully manned. They knew its gates could be opened by bribed or disgruntled guards. For them, the wall was a minor obstacle, not an ultimate defense. It was a symbol of the Chinese Empire's fear, a fear they were more than happy to exploit. The greatest example of this is when Genghis Khan's Mongol army invaded China in the 13th century. They were faced with a section of the wall that had been recently fortified. Did they spend months building siege engines to break it down? No. They simply rode their horses around the end of it. It's a moment that seems almost comical in its simplicity, but it reveals the fundamental flaw in the wall's concept. It was a solution designed by a settled, agricultural society to deal with a highly mobile, nomadic enemy. The wall was a line in the sand, but the Mongols fought on a borderless map. They proved that no wall could ever be long enough to contain an enemy that refused to play by the rules of siege warfare. Let's explore another dark secret hidden within the watchtowers. Life for the guards was, as we've said, lonely and boring. To combat this, they found ways to pass the time. Archaeologists have found evidence of this in the form of graffiti carved into the stones of the wall. These are not grand inscriptions, but simple human markings. A name, a date, a drawing of a horse, or a poem about how much they missed their home. These small carvings are incredibly poignant. They are the voices of the forgotten soldiers, reaching out across the centuries. They remind us that these weren't just faceless parts of a military machine. They were bored, lonely young men stuck in the middle of nowhere, dreaming of a life far away from the desolate frontier they were tasked to guard. Communication between the watchtowers was another fascinating aspect of life on the wall. The system was remarkably sophisticated for its time. During the day, they used smoke signals. Different combinations of smoke puffs could convey specific information, such as the number of approaching enemies and the direction they were coming from. At night, they used fire signals. This system created a chain of communication that could transmit a message over hundreds of miles in just a few hours, far faster than a rider on a horse. It was the ancient world's version of a telegraph line. A signal lit on a distant tower was a moment of high drama, instantly transforming the crushing boredom of guard duty into a moment of intense, life-or-death urgency for everyone down the line. However, this signal system had a critical weakness: the weather. On a foggy day or a stormy night, the smoke signals and fire beacons were completely useless. A thick fog could provide the perfect cover for a raiding party to approach the wall undetected. The guards would be effectively blind, staring out into a gray abyss, their greatest defense rendered inert by the elements. It's easy to imagine the terror of being on duty during such a storm, knowing that an attack could come at any moment and that you would have no way to warn the next tower. It was during these moments of vulnerability that the wall felt less like a formidable fortress and more like a fragile, isolated outpost at the mercy of both the enemy and nature itself. Let's talk about the weapons used by the defenders. The guards on the wall weren't just passive observers. They were armed with a variety of weapons to repel attackers who got too close. These included powerful crossbows, which could fire bolts with enough force to pierce armor from a distance. For close quarters fighting, they had spears and swords. But perhaps their most effective weapons were the simplest: rocks. The watchtowers were stocked with huge piles of stones. When attackers tried to scale the walls with ladders, the defenders would simply drop these heavy rocks on their heads. It was a brutal but highly effective tactic. In the heat of an attack, the great, sophisticated wall was often defended by the most primitive weapon imaginable, turning a feat of engineering into a scene of primal, desperate violence. There's also a secret hidden in the very bricks of the wall. During the Ming Dynasty, many of the bricks were stamped with a seal before they were fired in the kiln. This seal was not a symbol of the emperor, but something far more mundane. It was an identification mark, indicating which official was responsible for the production of that specific batch of bricks, and even the name of the kiln where it was made. This was a clever form of quality control. If a section of the wall collapsed or was found to be poorly constructed, the emperor's inspectors could trace the faulty bricks back to the official responsible. That official would then face severe punishment, which could include anything from demotion to execution. It was a system designed to ensure high standards through fear. This system of accountability reveals the immense pressure the officials in charge of construction were under. They were caught between the emperor's demand for speed and quality and the logistical nightmare of managing a massive, unwilling workforce in a remote location. Cutting corners could get the job done faster, but if those shortcuts were ever discovered, the price would be their own life. Every single brick was a potential piece of evidence that could be used against them. This stamped brick system is a small detail, but it speaks volumes about the paranoid, high-stakes political environment that surrounded the wall's construction. It was a project where failure, at any level, was not an option and carried the ultimate penalty. Let's descend from the wall and look at the lives of the women who were left behind. While the men were conscripted to build and guard the wall, the women had to take on all of their responsibilities back home. They became the sole caretakers of their parents, their children, and their land. They had to plow the fields, manage the harvest, and run the household entirely on their own. The wall created a society of absent husbands, fathers, and sons. This placed an incredible burden on the women of China, forcing them into roles that traditional society did not prepare them for. Their silent, uncelebrated labor was the hidden engine that kept the empire running while its manpower was being poured into the frontier defense. The emotional toll on these families was immense. A son or husband sent to the wall was often considered as good as dead. Letters were rare, and travel was impossible for most. Families would go years, even decades, without knowing if their loved one was alive or dead. There are countless poems from this era, many written by women, that express this deep sense of loss and longing. They speak of staring at the northern horizon, of sleepless nights filled with worry, and of the bitterness they felt towards the endless war and construction that had torn their families apart. These poems are a heartbreaking record of the wall's impact on the home front, a side of the story that is just as tragic as the deaths on the construction line. Now, for a particularly strange detail, the use of magic and superstition in the wall's defense. The soldiers on the wall were deeply superstitious. They lived in a constant state of fear and isolation, and they turned to the supernatural for comfort and protection. Talismans and charms were common, believed to ward off evil spirits or grant the wearer protection in battle. Some commanders even employed sorcerers or mystics who claimed they could predict enemy movements or cast spells to weaken the invaders. In a world governed by harsh reality, these beliefs provided a psychological shield, a small sense of control in a situation where they had very little. It was a way of coping with the immense stress of their existence on the edge of the known world. One of the most interesting legends involves the Earth Dragon. Some believe that the Great Wall was not just a stone structure, but was built to follow the path of a magical dragon that roamed the land. The builders were said to be following the dragon's trail, and the wall itself was seen as a way to either honor or contain this powerful earthly spirit. This belief infused the physical structure with a mystical significance. It wasn't just a military defense, it was a line of power, aligned with the spiritual forces of the landscape. This myth helped to justify the wall's often strange and winding path, which was in reality dictated by the terrain, but was much more inspiring to think of as the path of a divine beast. Let's move forward in time again, to the 19th and early 20th centuries. As China began to have more contact with the Western world, the Great Wall took on a new meaning. For Western visitors, it was a source of immense fascination. It became the ultimate symbol of China's ancient, mysterious, and seemingly unchanging civilization. Travelers and explorers wrote sensationalized accounts of the wall, emphasizing its immense scale and age. These stories helped to create the romanticized image of the wall that many in the West still hold today. It was portrayed not as a complex and often failed military project, but as a timeless wonder of the world, a testament to the power of a mythical Oriental empire. This Western fascination, however, often came with a condescending tone. The wall was sometimes used as a symbol of China's isolationism and backwardness. It was seen as a sign of a culture that had turned its back on the world, trying to wall itself off from progress. This interpretation completely ignored the real strategic reasons for the wall's existence, and repurposed it as a metaphor to fit the colonial attitudes of the time. The wall became a convenient symbol for everything the West thought was wrong with China: its resistance to outside influence, its massive but inefficient use of labor, and its focus on a glorious past instead of a modern future. It was a profound misreading of a complex piece of history. During China's century of humiliation, from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, the wall became a symbol of national weakness for the Chinese people themselves. The crumbling, neglected structure seemed to mirror the state of the nation. It was a reminder that even their greatest historical achievement had not been enough to protect them from foreign invasion and domination by Western powers in Japan. The wall, once a source of pride, became a painful symbol of failed defense. Its breached gates and crumbling sections were a physical manifestation of a nation whose sovereignty had been violated, its pride deeply wounded. The sleeping dragon on the hills seemed less like a protector and more like a relic of a failed strategy. Then, under the communist government led by Mao Zedong, the wall's image was dramatically rehabilitated. It was reinvented as a symbol of the strength and perseverance of the Chinese working class. The emperors who built it were downplayed, and instead the focus was shifted to the millions of laborers who toiled and died during its construction. The wall was no longer a symbol of imperial oppression, but a testament to the collective power of the people. Mao famously declared, "He who has not reached the Great Wall is not a true man," turning a visit to the wall into a kind of patriotic pilgrimage. It was a masterful piece of political rebranding, transforming the wall into a cornerstone of modern Chinese national identity. This brings us to the wall as it exists today, a major tourist attraction. The sections of the wall that millions of people visit each year, like Badaling near Beijing, are heavily restored. They are not what the wall looked like for most of its history. They are cleaned up, rebuilt, and made safe for visitors, complete with handrails and cable cars. This creates a highly sanitized and misleading experience. Tourists walk along a perfect, pristine version of the wall, with no sense of the dirt, the danger, and the death that defined its actual existence. The very act of restoring it for tourism erases much of its dark and difficult history, presenting a theme park version of a structure that was once a brutal and unforgiving frontier. In stark contrast to these restored sections, most of the Great Wall is actually in ruins. Away from the tourist hotspots, vast stretches of the wall are crumbling, overgrown, and slowly disappearing back into the landscape. Some estimates suggest that over 30% of the Ming Wall has already vanished completely. These unrestored sections are perhaps a more honest monument to its history. They show the wall not as a timeless wonder, but as a human creation, subject to the decay of time and the forces of nature. Walking along these wild wall sections is a completely different experience. It is quiet, lonely, and feels far more connected to the true spirit of the soldiers who once stood guard there. The preservation of the wall is now a huge challenge. It's simply too long to be fully protected. While the government works to preserve the most famous parts, remote sections are still being damaged by erosion, weathering, and even by local farmers who still sometimes take bricks for their own use. There's a constant tension between developing the areas around the wall for tourism and the economy, and the need to preserve this immense historical artifact. What parts should be saved? What parts should be left to crumble naturally? These are difficult questions with no easy answers. The wall, even in its old age, continues to be a source of conflict and complex decision-making for modern China. Let's consider one final strange secret. The wall was not just a physical barrier, it was also a massive information-gathering system. The soldiers stationed in the watchtowers were the eyes and ears of the empire on the frontier. They were tasked with observing the movements of the nomadic tribes, even in times of peace. They would record information about tribal politics, leadership changes, and potential conflicts. This intelligence would be sent back to the capital, giving the emperor a crucial understanding of the situation beyond his borders. The wall was, in a sense, a massive surveillance network, a line of listening posts that allowed the Chinese state to monitor its unpredictable neighbors and try to anticipate their next move. This intelligence-gathering role meant that life on the wall was not always about waiting for a fight. It also involved a degree of diplomacy and interaction. Guards at the gates would interact with traders and envoys who were permitted to cross. They would learn snippets of their language and customs. This created a strange duality. The wall was a symbol of separation, but it was also one of the few places where the two vastly different cultures of the steppe and the farmlands actually met face to face. The men on the wall were not just soldiers. They were also the empire's frontline diplomats and intelligence agents, managing a complex and often delicate relationship with the world outside. There were even instances of people choosing to cross the wall permanently. Chinese peasants, fleeing from famine or oppressive taxes, would sometimes desert and seek a new life with the nomadic tribes. Conversely, nomads who had fallen on hard times might choose to settle and farm on the Chinese side. The wall was a barrier, but it was a porous one. People, ideas, and goods continued to flow across it, both legally and illegally. This reality undermines the simple narrative of the wall as an impenetrable shield. It was more like a heavily guarded border, a place of tension and control, but not a complete block to human movement and interaction. Let's focus on the architecture of the watchtowers themselves. They were not just simple lookout posts. They were miniature fortresses, designed to be self-sufficient for a period of time during an attack. The ground floor was used for storing weapons, food, and water. The upper floors were the living quarters for the small group of soldiers stationed there, and the very top was the open platform for observation and signaling. The design was incredibly functional. The windows were small, just wide enough for an archer to shoot through. The entrance was often a raised door that could only be accessed by a ladder, which could be pulled up during an attack, making it very difficult for enemies to enter. The spacing of the watchtowers was also a matter of careful strategic calculation. They were meant to be placed within sight of each other, creating that uninterrupted chain for signal fires. The ideal distance was said to be, quote, 2 arrow shots, close enough that soldiers from one tower could provide covering fire to support their neighbors in the next tower over. This created an interlocking system of defense. An attack on one point of the wall could be met with fire from multiple directions. It was a clever design that aimed to turn a long, vulnerable line into a series of connected strongpoints. However, the difficult terrain of the mountains often made this ideal spacing impossible to achieve in reality. What about the end of the wall? We often see pictures of it snaking over mountains, but where does it actually stop? The most famous endpoint of the Ming Wall is in the east, at a place called Lalongtu, or the Old Dragon's Head. Here, the wall dramatically meets the Bohai Sea. The fortress juts out into the water like the head of a stone dragon taking a drink. It was a powerful symbolic statement, suggesting that the emperor's domain extended right to the edge of the ocean, leaving no gap for invaders. It's one of the most visually stunning parts of the entire wall, a definitive end to the long, winding journey of the stone barrier across the continent. The western end of the Ming Wall is just as significant, though far less visited. It's at a place called the Jiayu Pass, located in the stark and beautiful Gobi Desert. This fortress was considered the last outpost of Chinese civilization. A gate here was famously known as, quote, the Gate of Sighs, because it was the last gate that officials who had been exiled from the imperial court would pass through on their way to the remote and desolate western regions. To pass through this gate was to leave the civilized world behind and enter the land of the barbarians. It was a place of profound sadness and finality, the point where the empire's protection officially ended. The Jiayu Pass fortress is a masterpiece of defensive architecture. It had a complex system of inner and outer walls, gates, and towers, designed to trap any invading force that managed to breach the first line of defense. It was a formidable obstacle, located at a strategic choke point in the landscape. But like the rest of the wall, its true strength lay not in its stones, but in the loyalty of the people defending it. The fortress at Jiayu Pass stood for centuries as a symbol of the empire's western reach, a lonely but powerful statement of imperial authority in the middle of a vast and empty desert, the final full stop at the end of the wall's long sentence. So when we think of the Great Wall, we should resist the temptation to see it as one thing. It was never just one thing. It was a military defense, a political statement, an economic drain, a human tragedy, an environmental disaster, and a cultural symbol. It was a success and a failure, often at the same time. The story of the wall is the story of China itself, a story of immense ambition, incredible ingenuity, deep-seated fear, and a staggering capacity to endure suffering in the pursuit of a grand idea. It is a story written not just by emperors, but by every forgotten soldier, every conscripted farmer, and every grieving wife. The dark secrets of the wall are not really secrets at all. They are the human stories that have been paved over by the grand, simplified narrative of history. The secret is that the wall is not a story about stone, but a story about people. It's the story of the engineer who designed a clever drainage system to keep the wall from being washed away by rain. It's the story of the guard who carved his name into a brick, wanting someone, someday, to know that he was there. It's the story of the farmer who looked up at the wall snaking over his ancestral land and saw not a protector, but a cage. The sheer variety of the wall is also part of its hidden truth. There are sections made of packed earth that are over 2,000 years old, and sections of Ming-era brick that look like they were built yesterday. There are parts that run through dense forests, and parts that are slowly being swallowed by the sands of the Gobi Desert. There is no single Great Wall experience. Its character changes dramatically depending on where you are along its thousands of miles. To truly understand it, you would have to see it all, from the dragon's head in the sea to its final gate in the desert sands. Another aspect that is often overlooked is the sheer, mind-numbing boredom that must have defined life for most of the people associated with the wall. For every moment of terror during an attack, there were thousands of hours of quiet, lonely observation. For every day of frantic construction, there were months of repetitive, back-breaking labor. The true enemy for many was not the raiders from the north, but the slow, grinding passage of time, the monotony of the days, and the feeling of being a tiny, insignificant part of an immense and seemingly endless project. It was a war fought not just against invaders, but against despair itself. Let's consider the modern legacy of the wall and its impact on the world's imagination. It has become a bucket list destination, a backdrop for countless photographs, and a fixture in popular culture. It's used in movies as a shorthand for China, a massive, instantly recognizable symbol. But this fame has a strange effect. It flattens the wall's complex history, turning it into a simple, consumable image. The wall becomes a product, a brand, disconnected from the centuries of political struggle and human suffering that created it. The very act of making it an icon threatens to erase the difficult truths we've been exploring tonight. It becomes a beautiful picture, but the story gets lost. So as this powerful symbol gets simplified for postcards and vacation photos, its original, more complicated functions are forgotten. One of its most important roles had nothing to do with massive invasions. For long periods of peace, the wall was not a shield against armies, but a tool for customs control. Think of it as the world's longest and most heavily armed tax office. The gates were official entry points where trade caravans had to pass, and more importantly, had to pay taxes on their goods. The wall was a way for the empire to regulate and profit from the Silk Road and other trade routes, turning the flow of commerce into a river of silver for the imperial treasury. This economic function is far less romantic than the image of brave soldiers fighting off hordes of invaders, but it was a crucial part of the wall's daily existence and a primary reason for its continued maintenance. And wherever there are taxes, there are smugglers. The Great Wall created a massive black market. The very barrier, meant to control the flow of goods, made illegal trade incredibly profitable. Items like salt, iron, and silk could be bought cheaply on one side and sold for a fortune on the other if you could get them across without paying the hefty imperial tariffs. This gave rise to a whole class of people who specialized in defying the wall. They were not raiding warriors. They were cunning criminals who knew the terrain, the schedules of the patrols, and, most importantly, which guards were willing to look the other way for a share of the profits. The wall, a symbol of imperial order, inadvertently created a thriving ecosystem of organized crime along its entire length. Imagine a smuggler in the dead of night. He isn't trying to storm a fortress. He's leading a mule laden with carefully wrapped bundles of silk through a narrow, hidden ravine, miles from the nearest official gate. His heart pounds with every loose stone that tumbles down the hillside. He's not afraid of an army, but of a two-man patrol stumbling upon him. His destination is a prearranged spot, a section of the wall where a specific guard is on duty. He will pay this guard a bribe, a fraction of the official tax, and the guard will lower a rope to haul the precious cargo up and over the wall. This was the reality of the wall's defense in many places. It wasn't a story of heroic battles, but of quiet, tense, and illegal business transactions conducted in the shadows between desperate merchants and underpaid soldiers. Let's think about the life of that guard who takes the bribe. He's not necessarily an evil man or a traitor. He's likely a young farmer who was conscripted and sent hundreds of miles from home. His official pay is meager and often stolen by his superiors before it ever reaches him. His family is starving back home, and he hasn't seen them in years. The government that demands his loyalty is the same one that is letting him and his comrades rot on this miserable frontier. Then, one night, a man offers him more money than he would make in a year just for looking the other way for 10 minutes. For him, the choice is not between loyalty and treason. It's between an abstract duty to a distant emperor and the very real survival of his family. The wall's greatest weakness was always the humanity of the men who guarded it. The wall was not just a line on a map. It was a living, breathing entity with its own internal systems. We touched on the signal towers, but let's consider the sheer pressure on the men who operated them. A signalman's job was one of immense responsibility. If he fell asleep, was distracted, or misread a distant smoke signal, he could doom an entire section of the frontier. A mistake could mean that reinforcements would be sent to the wrong place, or worse, that no warning would be sent at all. The entire defensive strategy of the wall rested on the attentiveness of these isolated men. The price for failure was incredibly high, often execution. They lived a life of intense boredom, punctuated by moments where the fate of thousands rested entirely on their ability to correctly interpret a puff of smoke on the horizon. The code they used was more complex than just "fire means trouble." The system was designed to convey detailed information quickly. For example, the number of smoke puffs could indicate the size of the enemy force, from a small raiding party to a full-scale army. The materials they burned were also part of the code. In many regions, they used wolf dung to create a thick, dark, and very distinctive column of smoke that could be seen from a great distance. The smell alone would have been a signal of dread. At night, the color of the fire or the raising and lowering of lanterns could transmit different messages. It was a simple but effective binary code, the nervous system of the empire, transmitting warnings across the landscape at the speed of sight, all powered by the lonely vigilance of a few men and the burning of dried animal waste. While humans were busy fighting and signaling along the wall, a different kind of life was taking over. For centuries, the wall has been slowly merging with the natural world, creating a unique, man-made ecosystem. The structure provides habitats that didn't exist before. The millions of cracks and crevices in the stone have become homes for insects, lizards, and small mammals. Certain types of plants, like hardy grasses and tenacious shrubs, have taken root in the mortar, their roots slowly but surely breaking the stones apart. In the spring, parts of the crumbling wall are covered in wildflowers, creating a strange and beautiful image of nature, reclaiming a monument of human conflict. The wall is no longer just a historical artifact. It is a long, thin wildlife corridor and a vertical garden stretching for thousands of miles. The watchtowers, in particular, have become prime real estate for birds. Birds of prey, like eagles and falcons, use the high towers as nesting sites and vantage points for hunting. They offer a commanding view of the surrounding landscape, the very same reason the soldiers built them in the first place. Swallows and swifts build their mud nests under the eaves of the towers, sheltered from the elements. Over the centuries, the wall has become a crucial part of the life cycle for countless bird populations. In a way, they have become the wall's new sentinels. They stand guard where soldiers once did, their calls replacing the sound of military horns, their hunting flights replacing the flight of arrows. They are a living testament to the fact that no matter what humans build, nature will eventually find a way to make it its own. This process of nature reclaiming the wall is both beautiful and destructive. The same roots that create lovely cascades of flowers are also contributing to the wall's demise. The constant freezing and thawing of water in the cracks of the stone pushes them apart, while the wind and rain slowly erode the surfaces. This is the great dilemma for preservationists. To remove the plants and seal the cracks would be to destroy the unique ecosystem that has developed over centuries. But to leave it alone is to accept that the wall will eventually crumble and disappear completely. The battle on the wall today is not between armies, but between human history and the relentless, patient forces of the natural world, a quiet conflict being waged on every single brick. Let's talk about the name of the wall in Chinese, Wan Li Chang Chang. This is usually translated as the Great Wall of 10,000 Li. But this name is a secret in itself, because it's not a literal measurement. In ancient Chinese, the number 10,000 was often used poetically to simply mean countless or immeasurable, and a li was a unit of distance, about a third of a mile. So the name doesn't mean it's literally 10,000 li long. It means the endless wall, or the immeasurably long wall. The name itself is a piece of mythology, designed to evoke a sense of infinite scale and impossible ambition. It was meant to inspire awe and fear, to be a name as intimidating as the structure itself. It's a reminder that the wall was always part physical object and part powerful idea. This poetic name also reveals something about the psychological purpose of the wall. It wasn't just meant to keep people out, it was meant to define the very concept of China. Everything inside the endless wall was the civilized world, the Middle Kingdom. Everything outside was a vast, chaotic wilderness inhabited by barbarians. The wall was a line drawn between order and chaos, culture and savagery. It was a mental boundary as much as a physical one. By giving it a name that suggested infinity, the builders were reinforcing the idea that Chinese civilization was a vast, permanent, and all-encompassing reality, while everything beyond was a formless, nameless threat. The name itself was a tool of state-building and cultural identity. Now, let's turn to a much grimmer reality of life on the wall: medicine, or the almost complete lack of it. For the hundreds of thousands of laborers and soldiers, a serious injury or illness was often a death sentence. There were no field hospitals, no trained surgeons, and no understanding of germs or infection. Medical care was rudimentary at best, consisting of basic folk remedies and herbal treatments. A deep cut from a sharp stone could easily become infected, leading to a slow and agonizing death. A broken leg from a fall meant you could no longer work, and if you couldn't work, you were often left to die, as you were no longer useful to the state. The casualty rate from accidents and disease was likely far higher than the rate from actual combat. The conditions in the work camps were a breeding ground for disease. The workers were malnourished, exhausted, and lived in cramped, unsanitary quarters. Water sources were often contaminated. This led to frequent outbreaks of dysentery and other waterborne illnesses that could sweep through a camp and kill hundreds of men in a matter of weeks. The foremen were not concerned with the health of their workers, only with meeting their construction quotas. A sick man was simply a broken tool to be discarded and replaced. This brutal calculus is one of the darkest secrets of the wall. The majestic structure we see today was built on a foundation of unimaginable suffering, where the value of a human life was measured purely by its capacity for physical labor. Even the soldiers in the garrisons were not much better off. While they might have had slightly better food and shelter than the conscripted laborers, they still faced the constant threat of illness, and they also had to deal with the psychological toll of their posting. Living in a constant state of isolation and fear, with poor nutrition and little hope for the future, weakened their bodies and their spirits. We know from ancient records that commanders on the wall frequently sent requests to the capital, not just for weapons and grain, but for medicines and physicians, requests that were often ignored or went unfulfilled. The men who guarded the empire were, in many ways, completely unprotected from the invisible enemies of disease and despair. The wall's presence was so profound that it became a central theme in Chinese art and literature, but not always in the way you might expect. While some official court paintings depicted the wall as a majestic symbol of imperial power, much of the poetry from the time tells a very different story. For centuries, poets wrote about the wall with a sense of deep sorrow and bitterness. It was not a symbol of glory, but a symbol of separation and death. They wrote from the perspective of the soldier longing for home, or the wife left behind, staring north into the cold wind. These poems became a powerful form of cultural memory, preserving the human cost of the wall in a way that official histories never could. One of the most famous poets of the Tang Dynasty, Du Fu, wrote about the grim reality of conscription for projects like the wall. His poems speak of officials seizing men like hounds and chickens, of the weeping of mothers and wives as their men are dragged away. He describes the bones of the dead lying unburied on the frontier, bleaching in the sun. This was not propaganda. It was a raw and honest depiction of the suffering that these grand imperial projects caused. This kind of art was a quiet rebellion, a way of insisting on the value of individual lives in the face of a state that treated them as disposable. It ensures that the silent victims of the wall would have a voice that would echo through the centuries. There's a recurring image in this poetry, the moon. The same moon that shines on the family back home also shines on the lonely soldier at his post on the wall. The moon becomes a symbol of both connection and separation. It is the only thing that the soldier and his distant family can share. This poignant image captures the deep sense of homesickness and isolation that defined a soldier's life. The wall was a place that cut you off from everything you loved, and the cold, distant light of the moon was a constant, painful reminder of the world you had lost. These poems transformed the wall from a military structure into a landscape of human emotion, a place of profound and enduring sadness. Let's consider the logistical challenge of simply feeding the army of the wall. Keeping hundreds of thousands of men supplied with grain in such a remote area was one of the greatest challenges the empire faced. The cost of transporting food to the frontier was enormous. It was said that by the time a bag of grain reached the wall from the southern heartlands, the cost of its transportation was many times greater than the value of the grain itself. This massive logistical burden was a constant drain on the imperial treasury. The wall didn't just cost lives, it cost a fortune, and this economic strain was a major factor in the collapse of more than one dynasty. To solve this problem, the government established a system of military agricultural colonies, known as Tunchin. The idea was to make the frontier self-sufficient. Soldiers were ordered to spend part of their time farming the land near the garrisons where they were stationed. They would switch between being soldiers and being farmers according to the season. In theory, this was a brilliant solution. In practice, it was deeply flawed. The land on the northern frontier was often arid and infertile, completely unsuitable for the kind of intensive agriculture practiced in the south. The soldiers were often terrible farmers, and the crops frequently failed, leaving the garrisons on the brink of starvation and still dependent on supplies from the capital. This system also created a deep resentment among the soldiers. They had been sent to the frontier to be warriors, to defend the empire. Instead, they were being forced to do the back-breaking work of peasants, digging in the hard, unforgiving soil for meager returns. It was seen as a dishonorable and humiliating duty. This frustration, combined with the poor living conditions and corrupt leadership, made morale plummet. A soldier who feels more like a starving farmer than a proud defender is not going to be a very motivated fighter. The failed dream of a self-sufficient wall is another of its hidden stories, a tale of a clever plan that shattered when it met the harsh realities of the northern landscape and human nature. Another dark secret lies in the reason for the wall's final, great phase of construction under the Ming Dynasty. It was not just a response to a general threat, but to a specific, deeply humiliating event. In 1449, in what's known as the Tumu Crisis, The Mongol leader Esen Taishi launched a raid into China. The young Ming emperor, Zheng Tong, decided to personally lead an army to crush him. The campaign was a complete disaster. The emperor's army was ambushed and annihilated, and the emperor himself was captured and held for ransom. This was a catastrophic blow to the prestige and security of the dynasty. The capture of their emperor by the barbarians was a national trauma of the highest order. The response to this humiliation was not to develop a more flexible, mobile army to counter the nomadic cavalry. Instead, the Ming court turned inward, becoming deeply conservative and fearful. They adopted a defensive, isolationist posture. It was in this climate of fear and wounded pride that the obsession with wall building was born. The massive brick and stone wall we see today is, in many ways, a monument to this one catastrophic military failure. It was an attempt to ensure that such a humiliation could never happen again. The wall was a physical manifestation of a psychological trauma, an immensely expensive and labor-intensive security blanket for a dynasty terrified of the outside world. This historical context is crucial for understanding the Ming Wall. It wasn't built from a position of strength and confidence, but from a position of weakness and fear. The decision to pour vast resources into a static defense line was, in the eyes of many military historians, a strategic blunder. It locked the empire into a passive stance and drained the treasury, preventing investment in a more effective offensive army. The wall gave the illusion of security, but it was a brittle and ultimately ineffective defense, as the final invasion by the Manchus would prove. The Great Ming Wall, the most iconic version of the structure, is in reality a symbol of a dynasty's failure of imagination. Let's look at the wall through the eyes of the nomads one more time. The wall wasn't just a military or economic barrier. It was an insult to their entire way of life. The nomadic lifestyle was based on constant movement, on following the herds across vast, open grasslands. Borders were fluid, and the idea of a permanent, fixed line cutting across the land was completely alien. The wall was an attempt by an agricultural society to impose its own values of permanence and property onto a world that did not share them. For the people of the steppe, the wall was an act of arrogance, an attempt by the farmers of the south to tame a landscape that could never be tamed. The wall also had an unintended consequence for the nomads. By creating a common enemy and a hard border, it sometimes forced the disparate and often warring nomadic tribes to unify. The wall gave them a reason to band together, to form powerful confederations to challenge the Chinese Empire. In a strange irony, the very structure designed to defend against the nomads sometimes helped to create the powerful, unified threats that the empire feared most. The wall was a clarifying force, drawing a line that said us and them, and in doing so, it helped to forge the very identity of them into a more cohesive and dangerous political and military entity. We should also remember that the wall was never a completely sealed border. Even during times of high tension, there was a great deal of illegal, cross-border interaction. People on both sides had relatives and clan connections on the other. Chinese deserters would often become valuable advisors to nomadic leaders, bringing with them knowledge of the empire's technology and military tactics. Likewise, nomads would sometimes surrender or defect to the Chinese side. The wall was a membrane, not a solid barrier. It was a place of cultural mixing and shifting loyalties, a messy, complicated frontier, where identities were not always as clear-cut as the emperors in their distant capital liked to believe. Let's dive into the story of a specific section of the wall, like Simeitai. This section is famous for its incredible steepness and its unique, varied architecture. It runs along a mountain ridge so sharp it's often called the Heavenly Ladder. The towers here are much closer together than in other sections, and they are all different shapes and sizes, adapted to the treacherous terrain. Building this section must have been an absolute nightmare. Workers would have had to carry bricks and mortar up near vertical cliffs. The level of skill and sheer nerve required is difficult to comprehend. Simitai is a testament to the raw, brute force determination of the Ming builders, who refused to let even the most impossible landscape defeat their mission. One of the towers at Simitai is called the Fairy Tower. It's known for its delicate beauty and the intricate, decorative carvings found on its arched doorways. It's a strange detail to find in such a rugged, military structure. Why would the builders take the time to add these beautiful, non-functional details to a watchtower in such a remote and dangerous location? Perhaps it was the pride of the artisans who built it. Or maybe it was a small attempt to bring a touch of beauty and civilization to the harsh, brutal world of the frontier. Whatever the reason, this tower is a reminder that the wall was built by human beings, people who, even in the midst of a soul-crushing task, were still capable of creating moments of unexpected grace. Not far from the Fairy Tower is another, called the Sky Bridge. It's a section of the wall that is only about 16 inches wide, with sheer drops on either side. It connects two peaks along the ridge. For the soldiers who had to patrol this section, every step would have been a matter of life and death, especially at night or in high winds. It's a terrifying piece of engineering. This section perfectly illustrates the extreme lengths the Ming were willing to go to in their quest to create an unbroken barrier. They would not go around a mountain. They would go over it, no matter how dangerous or impractical. This small, terrifyingly narrow stretch of wall is a perfect metaphor for the dynasty's single-minded, almost fanatical obsession. The wall was also, in its own way, a massive scientific instrument. The long, continuous line provided a perfect opportunity for imperial astronomers and geographers to map the empire's northern frontier with a new level of accuracy. By taking measurements from the watchtowers, they were able to create more detailed and reliable maps than ever before. The wall served as a giant baseline, a fixed reference point in a vast and previously unmapped landscape. This scientific and cartographic function is another of the wall's forgotten purposes, a quiet contribution to knowledge that was happening in the shadow of its much more famous military role. It was helping the empire not just to defend its territory, but to understand it. There's a subtle but important secret in how the wall is constructed. The side of the wall facing the enemy is typically much taller and more heavily fortified than the side facing inward, towards China. The inner wall is often lower, with more staircases. This design feature had a practical purpose. It made it easy for Chinese soldiers to rush reinforcements up to the battlements, while making it much harder for any enemy who managed to climb the outer wall to get down into the land behind it. But it also had a powerful psychological effect. It created a clear one-way barrier. It was easy to get up on the wall from the inside, but hard to get down. The design itself subtly reinforced who belonged where. Let's consider the sound of the wall. For most of its history, it would have been a place of profound silence, broken only by the wind whistling over the battlements. This silence would have been a major part of the psychological burden on the guards. In the quiet, every strange noise, every gust of wind, could sound like an approaching enemy. The silence would have fueled their paranoia and anxiety. Then, this silence would be shattered by the sudden, frantic beating of a drum or the blast of a horn, the signal that an attack was imminent. The soundscape of the wall was one of long periods of tense silence, followed by moments of terrifying, chaotic noise. The wall has also been the site of some remarkable archaeological discoveries. In the deserts of western China, the dry climate has preserved things that would have rotted away long ago in other places. Archaeologists have found hundreds of ancient documents written on slips of wood and bamboo. These are not grand imperial edicts, but the mundane paperwork of the wall. They are supply lists, patrol schedules, letters from soldiers complaining about their pay, and reports on the price of horses. These small, forgotten pieces of paperwork are a treasure trove for historians. They provide a direct, unfiltered glimpse into the daily life and struggles of the people who lived and worked on the wall 2,000 years ago. Some of these ancient documents are surprisingly personal. One soldier writes a letter home, asking his family to send him more clothes because the winter is so cold. Another writes a shopping list for a trader who is heading to the nearest town. These fragments are incredibly powerful because they close the vast distance of time. They remind us that the people who built and defended the wall were not abstract historical figures. They were real people with the same worries, hopes, and daily concerns that we have today. They worried about being cold, they missed their families, and they needed to buy things from the store. These documents are the true secrets of the wall, the authentic voices of its forgotten inhabitants. The wall has also inspired its fair share of hoaxes and tall tales over the years. In the 1930s, an American adventurer named Robert Ripley, famous for his Ripley's Believe It or Not cartoons, is the one who popularized the myth that the wall is visible from the moon. There was no scientific basis for this claim. He just thought it sounded like a good story. But the idea was so compelling that it spread around the world and became an accepted fact for decades. It's a perfect example of how the mythology of the wall can be more powerful than the reality. The idea of the wall being visible from the moon is just too good of a story to let the boring facts get in the way. Another persistent myth is that the mortar used in the wall contains human bones. This is a story often told to emphasize the cruelty of the construction. However, there is no archaeological evidence to support this claim. The bodies of dead workers were buried alongside the wall, or sometimes in its earthen core, but they were not ground up and mixed into the mortar. The secret of the Ming mortar was, as we've discussed, sticky rice. The bone story is a piece of grim folklore, a legend that captures the emotional truth of the wall's human cost, even if it is not literally, factually true. It's another example of how people have used stories to process the incredible brutality of the wall's construction. Let's think about the wall at night. Under a clear, moonless sky, the view from a watchtower on the northern frontier must have been absolutely breathtaking. With no modern light pollution, the stars would have been incredibly bright, a vast canopy of silver dust. For the soldiers stationed there, this nightly spectacle would have been one of the few sources of beauty in their harsh existence. It would have also reinforced their sense of isolation. They were standing on the very edge of their world, looking up at a universe that was vast, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to their small human struggles. That cosmic perspective might have brought a sense of peace, or it might have deepened their feeling of being completely and utterly alone. The changing seasons would have dramatically transformed the character of the wall. In the spring, it would be surrounded by new green growth and wildflowers. In the summer, it would bake under a relentless sun, the stone becoming too hot to touch. In the autumn, it would be flanked by the brilliant colors of the changing leaves in the forests it passed through. And in the winter, it would be draped in a thick blanket of snow, transformed into a silent white serpent. The soldiers who served for years on the wall would have experienced all of these transformations. The wall was not a static, unchanging object for them. It was a dynamic part of their environment, its mood and appearance constantly shifting with the weather and the time of year. There's also the question of repairs. A structure this long is in a constant state of decay. Maintaining the wall was a never-ending task. There were teams of masons and laborers whose entire job was to patrol sections of the wall and fix the damage caused by weather and time. A small crack, if left unrepaired, could be widened by ice and rain until it became a major breach. The work of maintaining the wall was less dramatic than building it or defending it, but it was just as crucial. It was a slow, patient, and endless war against entropy, a constant effort to hold back the forces of nature that were always trying to pull the great structure down. The wall was also a source of inspiration for military engineers from other cultures. For centuries, visitors and envoys from other countries came to China and saw the Great Wall. They wrote about it in their own languages, and the idea of a massive, fixed defensive line entered the military thinking of people far beyond China. While no other civilization built anything on quite the same scale, the concept of the Great Wall has echoed through military history. It became the ultimate example of fortification, a legendary structure that other engineers studied and admired, even as they recognized its inherent strategic flaws. Its influence stretched far beyond the borders it was meant to defend. Let's consider the local gods and spirits that were believed to inhabit the areas where the wall was built. The construction of the wall was a massive intrusion into the landscape, and the builders would have been very conscious of the local deities they might be angering. It's likely that they performed rituals and made offerings to appease the spirits of the mountains and rivers that the wall crossed. These small local religious practices would have been an important part of the daily life of the construction crews. It was a way of seeking spiritual protection and trying to maintain a sense of balance with the powerful natural and supernatural forces that they were disrupting with their work. This brings us to the concept of feng shui, the Chinese art of placement and orientation to achieve harmony with the natural world. While the primary path of the wall was dictated by strategic military concerns, it's possible that the principles of feng shui influenced smaller details, like the exact placement of a gate or a tower. Engineers might have tried to align certain features with the flow of spiritual energy, or, quote, qi, in the landscape. This was not just superstition, it was seen as a way to ensure the strength and stability of the structure. A wall that was in harmony with the landscape was believed to be a stronger, more effective defense than one that fought against it. There are stories of sections of the wall that were said to be haunted. The ghosts of the countless workers who died during its construction were believed to linger, their mournful cries heard on windy nights. Soldiers stationed in certain watchtowers would report strange sightings or unexplained noises. These ghost stories were another way that the immense human trauma of the wall's construction was remembered and passed down. The stories served as an informal memorial to the nameless dead, ensuring that their suffering would not be entirely forgotten, even as their bones lay buried in the foundation. The wall was not just a physical place, it was a landscape teeming with the spirits of its victims. Let's go back to the animals. The wall was a barrier, but some animals learned to use it to their advantage. Predators like leopards and wolves would sometimes use the wall as a highway, allowing them to travel long distances without having to struggle through the difficult terrain of the forest or mountains below. It gave them a clear path and a high vantage point from which to spot their prey. In a strange twist, the structure designed to control the movement of humans became a tool that aided the movement of wild animals. It's another example of how the wall was integrated into the natural world in ways its builders could never have predicted. The wall has also had a surprising career as a sporting venue. In recent years, it has become the site of a grueling marathon, where runners from all over the world come to test their endurance on its steep steps and uneven surfaces. There have also been skateboarding and BMX events on certain sections of the wall. These modern uses are a source of controversy. Some people see them as a desecration of a sacred historical site. Others see it as a way of keeping the wall alive and relevant, of giving it a new purpose in the 21st century. It's the latest chapter in the wall's long history of being constantly reinterpreted and repurposed by new generations. Let's think about the sheer audacity of the entire project. The decision to build a wall of this scale represents a particular kind of imperial mindset. It is a statement of absolute power, a belief that you can reshape the very surface of the earth to suit your political will. It is a profoundly confident and, at the same time, a profoundly fearful act. It reflects a desire to create a perfect, orderly world, and a deep-seated anxiety about the chaos that lies just beyond your borders. The wall is the ultimate symbol of the imperial dream of total control, and also a symbol of the ultimate limits of that control. It is a monument to both the power and the paranoia of empires. There is a secret hidden in the bricks of the wall beyond just the maker's stamp. It's the sheer number of them. Estimates suggest that the Ming Wall alone contains billions of bricks. Each one of those bricks had to be made by hand. Clay had to be dug from the earth, mixed with water, pressed into a wooden mold, and then fired in a kiln for days. It was a slow, laborious, industrial process carried out on an almost unimaginable scale. When we look at the wall, we see the finished product, but we should try to picture the vast army of brickmakers, the thousands of smoking kilns, and the mountains of clay that were consumed to create this one structure. The wall was the product of a massive, coordinated industrial effort that lasted for centuries. And what about the people who designed it? We know the names of the emperors who ordered the wall, but the names of the architects and engineers who actually figured out how to build it are largely lost to history. These were brilliant men who solved incredible logistical and engineering challenges without any modern technology. They figured out how to build foundations on shifting sand, how to get supplies to the top of a mountain, and how to design a structure that could withstand both enemy attacks and the forces of nature. They were the unsung geniuses behind the wall, the master craftsmen whose skill and ingenuity are still visible in every perfectly constructed archway and every cleverly placed tower. The wall also functioned as a kind of social safety valve for the empire. It was a convenient place for emperors to send disgraced officials, political rivals, and convicts. Sending someone to the frontier was a way of removing them from the capital without having to execute them publicly. The wall was a place of exile, a remote and difficult land where troublemakers could be sent to live out their days in obscurity. This meant that the population on the frontier was a strange mix of loyal soldiers, conscripted peasants, and disgraced intellectuals, all forced to live together in a harsh and unforgiving environment. It must have been a place of fascinating and tense social dynamics. Ultimately, the greatest secret of the wall is its resilience, not as a physical structure but as an idea. The physical wall has often failed. It has been breached, bypassed, and has crumbled into ruin. But the idea of the wall has endured for thousands of years. It has been constantly reinterpreted and given new meaning by each successive generation. It has been a symbol of tyranny, a symbol of national pride, a symbol of isolation, and a symbol of endurance. Its ability to absorb all of these contradictory meanings is what makes it so powerful. The wall is not just a pile of stones. It is a mirror that China has held up to itself for centuries, reflecting its fears, its ambitions, and its ever-changing identity. This powerful idea of the wall as a mirror is reflected in how it was financed. While conscripted labor built the wall, the materials and supplies had to be paid for. This was often done through a special tax, a quote, wall tax, levied on the very farmers and merchants the wall was meant to protect. So the people of China paid for the wall 3 times over, with their money, with the forced labor of their sons and husbands, and with the economic disruption it caused. This created a deep and bitter irony. The symbol of their protection was also a primary source of their poverty and hardship. The financial drain of the wall was a constant simmering source of resentment that weakened the empire from within, proving that a nation can go bankrupt, building the very thing it believes will keep it safe. And the wall-building obsession wasn't limited to the famous northern frontier. The truth is, China is a land of many walls. Throughout history, regional lords and dynasties built thousands of miles of other, lesser-known walls. There were walls built to separate different provinces, walls to control the movement of people along internal rivers, and massive city walls that were, in their own right, some of the most formidable fortifications in the world. The Great Wall is just the most famous example of a much broader, deeply ingrained cultural belief in the power of walls to create order and security. It suggests that the desire to draw lines, to separate us from them, was a fundamental part of Chinese political philosophy for centuries, a strategy applied not just to foreigners, but to their own population as well. Let's look at the incredible engineering challenge of crossing a river. A wall is only as strong as its weakest point, and a river is a massive, natural gap. The builders couldn't just stop the wall at the riverbank. They had to continue it across the water. For smaller rivers, they would build massive stone-arched bridges, with watchtowers on top, essentially carrying the wall over the water. For larger, more powerful rivers, they would build huge stone dams or sluice gates that could be opened or closed. These structures were incredibly difficult and expensive to build, often requiring the temporary diversion of the entire river. They were also the points most vulnerable to attack and to the natural force of floods. The river gates of the Great Wall are some of its most impressive and forgotten feats of engineering. Now, let's return to the psychological state of the soldiers. We can imagine a condition we might call wall sickness. It would be a kind of madness born from the unique pressures of the frontier. Imagine a young soldier standing in a watchtower, day after day, week after week. The landscape never changes. The wind never stops. His companions are the same few sullen faces. He is caught in a state of hypervigilance, constantly straining his eyes to see an enemy that rarely appears. Combined with a soul-crushing boredom, he would become paranoid, seeing movement in the swaying grass. He would become detached, the world back home feeling like a distant dream. The wall was a place that could break a man's mind just as easily as it could break his body. This psychological strain was made worse by the sheer sensory deprivation. For much of the year, the landscape of the northern frontier is a monochrome world of brown earth and gray sky. The diet was monotonous, the work was repetitive, the sounds were few. This lack of stimulation could have profound effects. Men would have clung to any small object from home, a carved wooden charm, a wife's letter reread until it disintegrated, as a vital link to their former selves. They would have told the same stories over and over, sung the same songs, just to fill the immense silence. The true battle on the wall was often an internal one, a struggle to preserve one's own sanity against the slow, grinding erosion of the frontier life. The builders of the wall were not just fighting against enemies in the landscape, they were also fighting against the clock. Construction was often a seasonal affair. In the harsh northern winters, the ground would freeze solid, making it impossible to dig foundations or tamp earth. The mortar would not set correctly in the freezing temperatures. This meant that all construction had to happen in a frantic rush during the warmer months. This created immense pressure on the foremen to meet their quotas before the first snows fell. This rush is one of the reasons for the high number of accidents. Safety was sacrificed for speed. The changing of the seasons was a constant, unyielding deadline that dictated the pace of work and, ultimately, the fate of many of the laborers. Let's zoom in on the tools they used. We imagine massive cranes and complex machinery, but for most of the wall's history, the tools were incredibly simple. They were powered by human and animal muscle alone. Materials were moved using hand carts, wheelbarrows, and carrying poles balanced on men's shoulders. For steeper sections, they would form human chains, passing heavy baskets of earth or stone from one man to the next, all the way up the mountainside. The process was brutally inefficient but effective through sheer overwhelming numbers. The secret of the wall's construction is not a lost technology. It's the willingness of the state to deploy a virtually unlimited supply of disposable human labor to overcome any physical obstacle, no matter how immense. The wall also had a significant impact on the very language of China. Its presence was so dominant that it seeped into idioms and proverbs that are still used today. A phrase that translates to "building a long wall" can be used to describe a pointless, never-ending task. The story of Ming Jiangnu became a cultural touchstone for the idea of profound grief. The wall became a metaphor for any kind of obstacle or division. This linguistic legacy is a subtle but powerful testament to the wall's deep imprint on the collective consciousness of the Chinese people. It became more than a place. It became a part of the conceptual toolkit they used to describe their world and their experiences within it. One of the most overlooked aspects of the wall's history is the role of women who were not left behind, but who actually lived on the frontier. These were the wives and families of the officers and long-serving soldiers who were stationed in the larger garrisons. These women created a semblance of normal life in the shadow of the wall. They ran households, raised children, and established small markets. Their presence was crucial for morale and for the long-term stability of the frontier garrisons. They brought a touch of domesticity and community to what was otherwise a harsh, exclusively male, military world. They are almost completely absent from the official histories, but these frontier women were essential to the functioning of the wall as a lived-in space. These frontier communities also created a unique, hybrid culture. They were a melting pot of people from all over China, with different dialects, customs, and cuisines. They also had more direct contact with the nomadic peoples than anyone else in the empire. This led to a blending of cultures. Chinese soldiers would adopt elements of nomadic clothing for its practicality in the cold climate. Nomadic words might enter the local dialect. This frontier culture was likely viewed with some suspicion by the officials in the capital, who preferred clear lines of distinction. But the reality on the ground was messy and mixed. The wall, meant to be a great separator, inadvertently created a unique zone of cultural fusion at its base. Let's consider the wall's role in a very different kind of conflict: peasant rebellions. The wall was a powerful symbol of imperial oppression. The same taxes that paid for it and the same conscription that built it were often the sparks that ignited massive uprisings within China. When a peasant rebellion gained strength, the wall could become a liability for the emperor. Rebel armies could seize sections of the wall and its well-stocked garrisons, using them as a base of operations. The very weapon the empire had created to defend itself from external threats could be turned against it by internal ones. The history of the wall is not just about fighting foreigners. It's also deeply intertwined with the history of class struggle and civil war within China itself. There's a fascinating detail in the design of the wall's gates. The most important passes were not protected by a single gate, but by a series of them, creating a deadly trap. An invading force might break through the first gate, only to find themselves in a small, enclosed courtyard surrounded by high walls lined with archers. This was called a jar fortress, or barbican. While the invaders were trapped in this killing jar, the first gate would be closed behind them, and they would be annihilated by a hail of arrows from above. It was a simple but terrifyingly effective design. It reflects a deep understanding of psychological warfare. The design preyed on an attacker's sense of victory, luring them into a trap that turned their initial success into a final bloody defeat. What happened to the men who grew old on the wall? A soldier might be conscripted in his late teens and serve for 20 or 30 years on the frontier. If he survived, he would be a man in his 40s, his body broken by a life of hard labor and poor nutrition. He would have no other skills besides fighting and farming in a harsh climate. Returning to his home village, if it even still existed, would be almost impossible. He would be a stranger to his own family. Many of these veteran soldiers simply stayed on the frontier, settling in the wall towns. They were a lost generation, men who had given their entire productive lives to the wall, only to be left with nothing in the end. They were the human debris of the great imperial project. Let's talk about the horses. The conflict between the Chinese and the nomads was, at its heart, a conflict between infantry and cavalry. The Chinese Empire's greatest military weakness was its lack of good horses and pasture land. The northern steppes, on the other hand, were the greatest horse-breeding region in the world. The wall was, in essence, a massive, static defense designed to counter the superior mobility of the nomadic cavalry. It was an attempt to neutralize their greatest advantage. This is why trade in horses was so tightly controlled at the wall's gates. A steady supply of good horses was the one thing that could potentially allow the Chinese to project power out onto the steppe, so they tried to control the supply at all costs. The wall also served as a kind of quarantine line. In an age before modern medicine, disease could spread rapidly along trade routes. The wall, by channeling all traffic through a few controlled gates, allowed the imperial authorities to monitor and control the movement of people. especially during times of plague. Travelers who were suspected of being ill could be held in isolation outside the gates, preventing them from bringing a deadly epidemic into the heartland of China. This public health function is another of the wall's forgotten roles. It was a barrier not just against armies, but against the invisible invaders of pestilence and disease, making it an early and incredibly large-scale experiment in biosecurity. Let's explore the story of a specific individual, a general named Qi Jiguang, who was one of the great architects of the Ming Wall in the 16th century. He was a brilliant and innovative military commander who spent years of his life supervising the construction and defense of the wall. He was not just a builder, he was a reformer. He wrote military training manuals, designed new types of watchtowers, and developed new tactics for coordinating infantry and artillery on the wall. He was obsessed with making the wall an effective, integrated defensive system. Qi Jiguang represents the ideal of the wall's defenders, dedicated, intelligent, and deeply committed to the protection of the empire. His work represents the peak of the wall's military sophistication. One of Qi Jiguang's key innovations was the construction of hollow watchtowers that could be used as living quarters and storage depots for a small squad of soldiers. Before him, many towers were solid earth or brick. His new design turned each tower into a self-contained mini-fortress. This meant that the soldiers could live directly on the wall itself, allowing them to respond to a threat almost instantly. He also standardized the design of these towers, which made them faster and cheaper to build. His practical, forward-thinking approach transformed the wall from a simple barrier into a more dynamic and responsive defensive line. He was one of the few commanders who truly understood that the wall's strength came not from its height or thickness, but from the skill and organization of the men who defended it. Despite his brilliance and dedication, Qi Jiguang's story also has a tragic end. He was a victim of political infighting in the imperial court. His rivals grew jealous of his success and influence. After his powerful patron at court died, he was removed from his command on the frontier, disgraced, and sent into a forced retirement. He died in poverty and obscurity. His story is a powerful reminder that the fate of the wall was always tied to the poisonous politics of the distant capital. No matter how strong a general made the physical wall, its true vulnerability was always the political weakness and corruption of the dynasty it was built to protect. The empire's greatest enemy was often itself. Let's consider the simple act of walking. For the soldiers who patrolled the wall, walking was their primary job. They would walk for hours every day, back and forth along their designated section, in all kinds of weather. Their world would shrink to the narrow stone pathway under their feet. They would come to know every single brick, every crack, every loose stone on their route. This endless, repetitive walking would have been a kind of meditation, a state of mind-numbing routine. The physical act of pacing the wall was the central rhythm of their lives. It's a simple human detail that is easy to forget, but this constant, weary walking was the most fundamental act of the wall's defense. The diet of the workers and soldiers was not just monotonous, it was often dangerously deficient in essential nutrients. The standard ration was usually millet, a hardy grain that could be grown in the north. They would have eaten it as a thin porridge or a dense, tasteless bread. Fresh vegetables and meat were rare luxuries. This poor diet led to widespread health problems like scurvy and other vitamin deficiencies. The men were being asked to perform incredibly demanding physical labor, while being systematically weakened by malnutrition. This is another reason why the death toll from disease and exhaustion was so high. The men were literally being starved into weakness by the same logistical system that was supposed to keep them strong enough to work. What about the legacy of the wall and the landscape itself? The construction of the wall required a massive network of quarries and brick kilns. Even centuries after the wall was abandoned, the scars of this industrial activity are still visible in the landscape. You can find the overgrown remains of old quarries where the stone was cut, and the collapsed ruins of the kilns where the bricks were fired. These forgotten industrial sites are an important part of the wall's story. They are a reminder of the immense logistical and industrial effort that supported the construction. The wall didn't just appear on the mountain ridges. It was the final product of a vast and destructive industrial process that reshaped the entire region. The wall has also become a powerful symbol in the world of modern diplomacy. When foreign leaders visit China, they are almost always taken to see the Great Wall. This is a very deliberate piece of political theater. The visit is meant to be a photo opportunity that sends a clear message. It showcases China's long history, its immense power, and its enduring civilization. It is a subtle but powerful way of framing the modern political relationship in the context of China's ancient legacy. The wall is no longer a defensive barrier against nomads. It is now a backdrop for international relations, a tool of soft power used to impress and intimidate visiting dignitaries. Let's think about the wall from an even wider perspective, from the perspective of a bird flying high above. From that height, the wall would look like a thin gray thread stitched across the vast, rolling green and brown blanket of the earth. You would see how it slavishly follows the contours of the land, climbing the steepest ridges and descending into the deepest valleys. This aerial view reveals both the incredible ambition of the project and its ultimate futility. You can see how an army could simply go around it, or find one of its many gaps. The bird's eye view reveals the wall for what it is, a monumental effort by humans to draw a permanent line on a landscape that is fundamentally borderless. The wall's relationship with the Silk Road is a complex one. The wall was built to control and protect the lucrative trade route, but it could also stifle it. During times of high tension, the gates would be closed, and all trade would cease. This would be economically devastating for the merchants on both sides. The wall was like a tap that the empire could turn on or off at will. This power to control trade was a major source of the empire's leverage over the nomadic tribes. They could use the promise of open gates and profitable trade as a tool to keep the nomads peaceful, a carrot to go along with the stick of military defense. The wall was not just a shield, it was an economic weapon. The wall has also been the subject of some incredible modern art. Artists have used the wall as a canvas and as a source of inspiration. Some have performed endurance pieces, walking the entire length of the wall. Others have used its image to comment on modern issues of borders and division. This ongoing artistic engagement with the wall is a testament to its enduring power as a symbol. It shows that the wall is not just a relic of the past. It is a living part of our global culture, a structure that continues to provoke new ideas and new conversations about power, identity, and the lines we draw between us. Let's consider the keepers of the wall today. These are not soldiers, but conservationists, archaeologists, and local villagers who have taken it upon themselves to protect the crumbling sections of the wall in their area. These wall protectors patrol the wild sections, documenting damage, reporting it to the authorities, and sometimes performing minor repairs themselves. They are driven by a deep sense of connection to the history and the landscape. They are the latest in a long line of people who have dedicated their lives to the wall, not as a military defense, but as a precious and fragile piece of world heritage. Their quiet, often unrecognized work is the front line of the modern battle to save the wall from disappearing. The sound of the wall has changed. The silence of the ancient frontier has been replaced by new sounds. On the tourist sections, it's the constant chatter of crowds, the click of cameras, and the announcements from loudspeakers. On the wild sections, it's the hum of distant highways or the roar of airplanes passing overhead. The modern world is encroaching on the wall's ancient solitude. These new sounds are a reminder that the wall is no longer on a remote frontier. It is now embedded in the landscape of a modern, bustling nation. Its context has changed completely, from a line of defense at the edge of the world to a historical park in the middle of a global superpower. Let's look at the wall's negative space, the areas it was specifically designed to avoid. The wall was almost always built on the high ground, along mountain ridges. It avoided low-lying swamps and marshlands. These areas were seen as impassable for large armies anyway, so there was no need to build a wall there. This means that the path of the wall gives us a clear picture of what the ancient Chinese military considered to be strategically important terrain. It is a map of their fears and their strategic thinking. The gaps in the wall are just as informative as the wall itself, revealing the places where they believed nature had already provided them with a sufficient barrier. The wall also created a very specific kind of landscape in its immediate vicinity. For a few hundred yards on either side of the wall, the land was often deliberately cleared of all trees and shrubs. This was done to create a an open field of fire where there was no cover for any approaching enemy. This practice, carried out over thousands of miles, had a significant ecological impact. It created a unique, man-made corridor of open grassland that ran parallel to the wall. This is another example of how the construction of the wall didn't just place a structure on the landscape, it actively reshaped the entire environment around it to suit its military needs. Let's consider the concept of failure. By its primary military objective, the Great Wall was ultimately a failure. It did not permanently stop the nomadic invasions, and the dynasty that perfected it, the Ming, was eventually overthrown by an enemy that came right through its gates. But in a strange way, this failure is part of what makes the wall so compelling. It is a monument to the limits of human ambition. It is a testament to the idea that no amount of stone and mortar can protect a society from its own internal weaknesses or from the relentless tide of history. The wall's ultimate lesson is a tragic one, that the greatest threats often come from within, and that no wall is high enough to keep out a future that is destined to arrive. The wall's legacy is also deeply personal for many Chinese people today. There are millions of people whose family names are associated with the regions along the wall, whose ancestors were the soldiers and farmers who lived and died in its shadow. For them, the wall is not just an abstract national symbol, it is a part of their own family history, a direct link to their ancestors, struggles, and endurance. This personal, genealogical connection to the wall is a powerful, unspoken part of its significance. It turns a vast, impersonal monument into a landscape of personal memory, a place where family stories and national history intertwine. Let's talk about the weather. The climate on the northern frontier is one of extremes. The winters are brutally cold, with deep snow and biting winds. The summers can be scorching hot and dry. And in the spring, the region is plagued by massive sandstorms that can blow in from the Gobi Desert, reducing visibility to near zero and filling the air with choking dust. The soldiers and workers on the wall had to endure these extreme weather conditions with very little protection. The weather was a constant, formidable enemy, as dangerous as any human foe. It attacked their bodies, damaged their morale, and eroded the very structure they were building. The wall is a monument to human endurance, not just against armies, but against the full, brutal force of the natural world. The wall has also had a strange life in fiction, particularly in the West. It's often used as a setting for fantasy stories, a massive barrier designed to keep out hordes of monsters or magical creatures. This is a fascinating modern reinterpretation of its original purpose. The historical barbarians have been replaced with literal monsters. This fantasy trope, while entertaining, also has the effect of dehumanizing the real people who lived on the other side of the wall. It reinforces the simple, black and white narrative of civilization versus savagery that the emperors themselves promoted. The fantasy version of the wall is, in a way, a modern echo of the ancient imperial propaganda. Think about the graffiti we mentioned earlier. It wasn't just names and dates. Some of the carvings are more elaborate. There are poems lamenting a soldier's fate and crude drawings of loved ones. But there are also messages of defiance, curses against the foreman, or complaints about the emperor. These were incredibly risky things to write. If discovered, the author would have been severely punished. The fact that they still wrote them is a testament to their desperate need to express their frustration and to leave some kind of record of their true feelings. These small acts of anonymous rebellion are some of the most honest and human documents in the wall's entire history. The wall also had a profound effect on the nomadic societies it was built to contain. By restricting their movement and access to resources, the wall forced them to adapt. Some tribes were pushed further west, into Central Asia, where their migrations had a ripple effect, displacing other peoples and reshaping the political map of the entire continent. The wall was not just a feature of Chinese history, it was an engine of historical change for all of Central Asia. Its presence on the landscape created pressures that had consequences thousands of miles away. It's a powerful example of how a single massive structure can have a global impact that its builders never intended. Let's explore the wall's relationship with agriculture more deeply. The line of the wall roughly corresponds to a major geographical and climatic boundary. To the south of the wall, the land generally receives enough rainfall to support settled agriculture. To the north, the climate is much drier, and the land is more suitable for a nomadic, pastoral lifestyle based on herding animals. So the wall is not an arbitrary line. It is a man-made reinforcement of a pre-existing ecological boundary. It is an attempt to make permanent the division between the farmer and the shepherd, between the land of the crop and the land of the herd. This ecological context is fundamental to understanding why the wall was built where it was. The construction of the wall itself was a temporary disaster for the local agriculture. The massive armies of workers needed to be fed, and the local grain supplies were often simply confiscated by the state. The best farmland in the area was sometimes taken over for construction camps or brick kilns, and the deforestation caused by the need for fuel led to soil erosion that ruined what farmland was left. For the local peasants who lived right next to the wall, its construction was not a source of security, but a catastrophic event that destroyed their livelihoods and upended their entire way of life. They were the first and most direct victims of the Great Project. What about the end of a soldier's day? After a long shift of patrolling or standing guard, what did they do? In the larger garrisons, there might have been some simple forms of entertainment. Gambling was common, though officially forbidden. Men would play games with dice made of bone or wood. They would tell stories, sing songs, and drink rice wine if they were lucky enough to get it. These small moments of camaraderie and distraction were essential for survival. They were a way of creating a temporary bubble of normalcy in the middle of a deeply abnormal existence. It was in these quiet, off-duty moments that the men could, for a little while, forget that they were on the edge of the world. The wall has become a powerful symbol for things that have nothing to do with China. For example, the term Great Firewall of China is used to describe the country's system of internet censorship. This is a perfect modern metaphor. It takes the ancient idea of a physical wall designed to keep out foreign people and ideas and applies it to the digital world. It shows how the concept of the wall is so deeply ingrained in our global consciousness that it can be instantly understood when applied to a completely different technology. The idea of the wall is now a universal shorthand for any attempt to create a barrier and control the flow of information. There are also sections of the wall that are not made of brick or earth, but of the natural landscape itself. In some areas, the line of defense incorporated a steep cliff face or a deep river canyon. The builders would simply build watchtowers on either side of this natural obstacle, effectively making the mountain or the canyon a part of the wall. This was a practical and cost-effective strategy. It shows that the builders were not mindlessly following a single design, but were pragmatically adapting their plans to the realities of the local terrain. They were masters of using the landscape itself as a weapon, of seeing the defensive potential in a sheer rock face or a raging river. Let's consider the wall's secret doors. At various points along the wall, especially during the Ming Dynasty, engineers built secret gates. These were small, cleverly disguised openings that were designed to be used for surprise attacks. A small force of Chinese cavalry could ride out of one of these hidden gates, attack a nomadic raiding party from the flank or the rear, and then retreat back behind the wall before the enemy could react. These secret doors show that the wall was not always intended to be a purely defensive structure. It was also designed to be a platform for launching offensive strikes, a massive, fortified base of operations from which the empire could project its power. The lighting of the signal fires at night must have been a spectacular sight. Imagine a chain of brilliant orange flames suddenly erupting one by one along the dark mountain ridges, stretching for miles in either direction. For the people in the towns and villages to the south, the sight of the signal fires on the horizon would have been a moment of pure terror. It was a clear and unambiguous message that the frontier had been breached, that war was coming. The silent, beautiful line of fire in the night sky was a messenger of death and destruction, a signal that the fragile peace had been shattered, and that their world was about to be plunged into chaos. The abandonment of the wall after the Qing dynasty took power is a fascinating chapter in its story. For centuries, it was the most important military project in the empire. Then, almost overnight, it became completely irrelevant. The new rulers, the Manchus, came from beyond the wall. Their empire was vast, stretching far into the north and west. The wall was now in the middle of their territory, not at its edge. The garrisons were disbanded, the supplies were stopped, and the great structure was left to the wind and the rain. This sudden abandonment is a powerful reminder of how quickly political changes can render even the most massive physical structures obsolete. The wall went from being the center of the empire's strategic thinking to a forgotten relic in the blink of a historical eye. What did the common people think of the wall after it was abandoned? For the local farmers, it was likely a source of relief and opportunity. The relief came from the end of the hated conscription and taxes. The opportunity came from the wall itself. It was now a massive, free quarry. For the next few hundred years, local villagers systematically dismantled sections of the wall, taking the high-quality bricks and stones to build their own houses, farm walls, and pigsties. This recycling of the wall is a major reason why so much of it has disappeared. It's an ironic end for a structure built with so much suffering. The descendants of the people who were forced to build it were now using its remains to improve their own lives. The wall also played a small but interesting role in the conflicts of the 20th century. During the Second World War, some sections of the wall were used by Chinese soldiers as defensive positions in their fight against the Japanese invasion. The ancient fortifications were once again manned, and battles were fought along the same ramparts where Ming soldiers had fought centuries before. It was a poignant moment, a brief reawakening of the wall's original military purpose. It was a testament to the enduring strategic value of the terrain it occupied, and a symbol of China once again fighting to defend its territory from a foreign invader. Let's talk about the myth of the wall's perfect straightness. We often see stylized maps that show the wall as a straight line, but the real wall is anything but straight. It twists and turns, it zigs and zags, it doubles back on itself. Its path is a chaotic, organic line that is dictated entirely by the terrain. It clings to the mountain ridges, seeking the highest possible ground at all times. This winding path is one of the keys to its defensive strength. It made it impossible for an attacking army to approach the wall on a broad front. Instead, they would be forced into narrow valleys and passes, where they would be vulnerable to attack from the defenders high above them. The wall's crookedness was its genius. Another overlooked feature of the wall's ecosystem is the plant life that was deliberately cultivated by the soldiers. In the courtyards of the garrisons and on the small plots of land they farmed, soldiers would have planted not just grain, but medicinal herbs. In the absence of official doctors, knowledge of herbal remedies would have been a crucial survival skill. They would have also planted familiar vegetables from their home provinces, a small taste of the life they had left behind. These small gardens would have been islands of carefully cultivated life in the middle of a wild and hostile landscape, a testament to the human need to nurture and grow things, even in the most unlikely of places. The wall has also been a source of immense archaeological fraud. Because of the global fascination with the wall, artifacts purported to be from it can fetch a high price. This has led to a thriving market for forgeries, from fake soldiers' uniforms to counterfeit stamped bricks. There have also been cases of local communities building entirely new sections of ancient wall to attract tourists. These fakes and forgeries are a strange modern chapter in the wall's long history of myth-making. They show that our desire for a connection to the wall's epic story is so strong that we are sometimes willing to invent the physical evidence to support it. Let's consider the end of the story for the individual builder. For the vast majority of the men who were sent to build the wall, we have no record of what happened to them. They were illiterate peasants, and their names were not recorded in the official histories. They simply disappeared from their villages and were never heard from again. Their final resting place is unknown. Their stories are lost. The wall is, in this sense, the largest anonymous tomb on the planet. Its true secret is the sheer, overwhelming scale of the human experience that it has consumed and erased. It is a monument that is built, quite literally, on a foundation of forgotten lives. So the romantic image of the Great Wall, the single, beautiful stone dragon sleeping on the mountains, is a comforting illusion. The reality is a far more complex, brutal, and fascinating story. It is a story of countless different walls, built by different dynasties for different reasons. It's a story of failure as much as success, of human ingenuity and human cruelty on an epic scale. It is a story whose true meaning has been constantly reshaped by the politics and perceptions of later generations. The wall is not a simple statement of strength. It is a sprawling, contradictory, and deeply human text, written on the landscape over thousands of years, and we are still learning how to read it. To truly read this sprawling text, we must also look at the invisible structures that held it together. The wall itself was just the final, most visible piece of a much larger system. Behind the wall, the empire built a network of dedicated military roads. These weren't public highways. They were strategic arteries designed for one purpose: to move troops and supplies to the frontier as quickly as possible. A signal fire might warn of an attack, but that warning was useless without the ability to dispatch a relief force. These roads were a critical part of the wall's defensive logic, a web of logistical support that was just as important as the stone barrier itself, yet it remains almost entirely absent from the popular image of the wall. Without these roads, the wall would have been nothing but a long, isolated, and indefensible monument. Alongside these roads ran a sophisticated courier system. This was the empire's nervous system, carrying written messages and detailed intelligence reports back and forth between the capital and the frontier. Riders on fast horses would travel between a series of relay stations, switching to a fresh mount at each one to maintain incredible speed. A detailed report from a general on the wall could reach the emperor's desk in a matter of days, a remarkable feat of communication for the pre-industrial world. This system allowed the court to maintain some semblance of control over the distant frontier, but it was also a source of constant anxiety. A delayed rider or a message intercepted by bandits could have catastrophic consequences, leaving the capital blind and the frontier commanders isolated at the worst possible moment. And then there was the spy network. The wall was the front line, but the information war was fought far beyond it. The empire employed a vast network of spies, merchants, and diplomats who operated deep within the nomadic territories. Their job was to gather intelligence on tribal politics, to play different factions against each other, and to identify potential threats long before they reached the wall. The most effective defense against an invasion was to ensure it never started in the first place. This covert world of espionage and political manipulation was a crucial, if unseen, layer of the wall's defense. A bribe delivered to a tribal chief hundreds of miles north of the wall could be more effective at keeping the peace than 1,000 soldiers standing on its battlements. Let's consider the wall's role in creating a sense of shared identity. Before the first unified wall under Qin Shi Huang, the concept of China was much more fluid. People identified more with their local state or region. The act of building a massive, single project that required the labor of people from all corners of the new empire helped to forge a new, national consciousness. It was a brutal and coercive form of team building, but it was effective. The wall became a tangible symbol of the unified state, a shared experience of suffering that bound the disparate peoples together. The very thing that oppressed them also, in a strange and tragic way, helped to create the idea of them as a single people. The wall also served as a giant laboratory for technological and administrative innovation. The immense logistical challenges of the project forced the empire to develop new techniques for surveying, transportation, and resource management. The need to organize and control such a massive workforce led to new methods of census taking and social organization. These administrative and technological advancements, born from the practical needs of the wall, would then be applied to other parts of the empire. The wall was not just a static monument, it was an engine of innovation, a massive, state-funded research and development project that had far-reaching consequences for the development of Chinese civilization, a hidden benefit born from a project of immense suffering. Let's imagine the story of a quartermaster, an official named Lin, tasked with supplying a remote section of the wall. His life is a nightmare of logistics. He spends his days hunched over bamboo slips, trying to calculate how much grain, how many arrows, and how many pairs of sandals his garrison will need for the next 3 months. He has to fight with corrupt suppliers who send him rotting food and with lazy transport captains who are always late. If he orders too little, his soldiers will starve. If he orders too much, the grain will rot in the storehouses. A single mathematical error could get hundreds of men killed. He is not a warrior, but his job is just as critical and far more thankless. He fights a constant, invisible war against numbers, distance, and human greed. One day, Lin receives an urgent dispatch. A nomadic tribe is gathering near his section. He needs to prepare for a possible siege. This means he needs to double the rations and call in the local militia. But the autumn harvest was poor, and his storehouses are already low. He has to make an impossible choice. Does he impose a crippling emergency tax on the local villages, risking a rebellion? Or does he try to make do with what he has, risking the collapse of the garrison if the siege lasts too long? His decision will not be recorded in any glorious battle history, but the fate of the entire region rests on his shoulders. This is the quiet, desperate reality of the wall's defense, a world of impossible choices made by stressed, overworked bureaucrats. Let's turn to the world of botany. The construction of the wall had an unintended effect on the distribution of plants. The constant movement of men and supply caravans from the south to the north meant that the seeds of southern plants were accidentally carried along for the ride. They might be mixed in with horse feed or stuck to the clothes of the workers. Some of these southern seeds found a suitable niche and began to grow along the wall, far north of their natural range. The wall, therefore, became a long, thin corridor for botanical migration. It is another example of how this massive human project became an unwitting agent of ecological change, subtly rewriting the plant map of northern China. There is a secret in the very rhythm of the construction. The work was not a constant, steady process. It happened in fits and starts, driven by the political winds of the capital. A new emperor might come to the throne and decide that the wall was a waste of money, and all construction would halt for decades. Then, after a major raid, a new wave of fear would sweep the court, and a frantic new phase of building would begin. The wall is, in this sense, a physical record of the empire's fluctuating sense of security. The well-built sections correspond to periods of high anxiety, while the crumbling, neglected sections correspond to periods of confidence or distraction. You can read the political mood of a dynasty in its masonry. Let's consider the wall's impact on the law. The frontier was a notoriously lawless place, and the government had to create a special set of military laws to govern the soldiers and workers. These laws were incredibly harsh. The penalty for desertion, for falling asleep on duty, or for stealing supplies was almost always death. This created a climate of extreme fear and discipline, but it also meant that the frontier operated under a different legal system than the rest of China. It was a place where a man's life was cheap, and justice was swift and brutal. The wall was not just a line on a map, it was a legal boundary, separating the civil society of the heartland from the harsh military rule of the frontier zone. We've discussed how the wall kept people in, but let's deepen that idea. For the Chinese state, one of the greatest threats was not invasion but the flight of its own people. Peasants, crushed by taxes and famines, would often try to flee north to join the nomadic tribes, seeking a freer, if harder, life. The wall was a barrier against this. It was designed to keep the emperor's most valuable resource, his tax-paying farmers, from escaping. The guards on the wall spent as much time watching for people trying to get out as they did for people trying to get in. From this perspective, the wall was not a shield protecting a nation. It was the wall of a massive, open-air prison, designed to keep the population under state control. This function as a cage becomes even clearer when we look at the gates. The gates were not just for taxing merchants, they were checkpoints for controlling the movement of the emperor's own subjects. A common farmer would not be allowed to pass through the gate without a special travel permit, which was almost impossible to obtain. This turned the entire population of northern China into prisoners in their own land. The wall was a constant physical reminder that their lives were not their own, that their freedom of movement was subject to the whims of the state. It was a profound instrument of social control, a way of locking down the population and preventing dissent by simply making it impossible to leave. This idea of the wall as a prison also explains its immense length. If the only goal was to stop nomadic armies, the wall could have been much shorter, strategically placed to block key mountain passes and river crossings. But if the goal is to prevent your own population from escaping across a vast frontier, then you need a barrier that is as continuous as possible. The almost fanatical desire of the Ming emperors to close every gap and connect every section makes more sense when viewed as an act of population control. They were not just building a defense, they were building the ultimate tool of domestic policy, a line that could not be crossed without the state's permission. Let's imagine the story of a young couple from a village near the wall who have fallen in love, but their families forbid them to marry. Their only hope for a life together is to run away. But where can they go? The wall looms to the north, an impassable barrier. To the south, the empire's network of officials and magistrates makes it easy to track down fugitives. Their love story is trapped by the geography of control. The wall, for them, is not a distant symbol of national pride. It is a very real and personal obstacle, the northern edge of a cage from which they cannot escape. Their personal tragedy is a small-scale reflection of the wall's larger, more oppressive function. The wall has had a profound influence on modern architecture. The image of a long, winding structure that follows the contours of the landscape has inspired architects around the world. You can see echoes of the Great Wall in the design of everything from university campuses to public parks. It has become a design archetype for how to build a large structure that is integrated with, rather than imposed upon, the natural landscape. This is another of the wall's strange, ironic legacies. A structure that was once a symbol of a brutal division between humanity and nature is now a source of inspiration for creating harmony between the two. The wall's influence is also visible in the world of video games. Countless fantasy and strategy games feature massive defensive walls that are directly inspired by the Great Wall of China. It has become a fundamental part of the visual language of the genre. Gamers around the world have spent countless hours building, defending, and attacking virtual versions of the wall. This has introduced the idea of the wall to a new generation in a powerful, interactive way. But, like the tourist experience, it is a simplified, romanticized version. The game never simulates the tax burden of the wall, the despair of the conscripted builders, or the slow, grinding boredom of guard duty. Let's consider the wall's legacy in philosophy and political thought. The wall has been used as a powerful metaphor by thinkers for centuries. It has been used to discuss the pros and cons of isolationism, the nature of borders, and the relationship between the state and the individual. Does a wall provide security, or does it create a prison? Does it protect a culture, or does it cause it to stagnate? These are the questions that the wall forces us to ask. It is not just a historical object. It is a philosophical problem, a massive, real-world thought experiment whose lessons are still being debated today. The sheer visual power of the wall has also made it a target for modern protests and political statements. Dissident artists have used the wall as a backdrop for performances that critique the modern Chinese state's policies of control and censorship. By placing their art in this powerful symbolic location, they draw a direct line between the imperial oppression of the past and what they see as the political oppression of the present. This turns the wall into a contested space, a stage where the official patriotic narrative is challenged by a counter-narrative of dissent. The wall, even today, is not a silent monument. It is an active participant in the ongoing conversation about freedom and power in China. Let's tell one final story from the wall's history, the story of a brickmaker. His name is Wu, and he lives in a small village that has been commandeered by the army to produce bricks for a new section of the wall. His entire life is now governed by the rhythm of the kiln. He wakes before dawn to mix the clay with water, his hands constantly raw and chapped. He spends his days pressing the wet clay into wooden molds, his back aching from the repetitive motion. And he spends his nights tending the fire of the kiln, a roaring monster that must be fed a constant diet of wood. He knows that if his bricks are not perfect, if they crack in the fire, he will be beaten by the foreman. Wu rarely sees the wall itself. His world is the mud pit, the drying yard, and the fiery mouth of the kiln. But he hears the stories. He hears of the men who fall from the scaffolding and of the freezing winters on the frontier. He looks at the thousands of finished bricks stacked in the yard, each one identical to the next. He knows that soon, these bricks will be hauled up the mountain and will become a tiny, anonymous part of the great structure. And he knows that his own life is like one of those bricks, a small, uniform component in a vast, imperial machine, a life to be used up and forgotten, a secret ingredient in the mortar of the empire's ambition. The very soil around the wall has its own story to tell. Archaeologists who study the pollen trapped in ancient layers of earth can reconstruct the environmental history of the region. Their findings confirm the story of massive deforestation. They can see the point in the soil record where the pollen from trees suddenly disappears, replaced by the pollen of scrubby grasses. This scientific data is the silent, irrefutable testimony of the forests that were sacrificed for the wall. It is a story told not in words, but in microscopic grains of pollen, a quiet confirmation of the immense environmental price that was paid for this single, massive act of construction. There is also a hidden history of the wall that is recorded in the stars. The soldiers on the frontier were keen observers of the night sky. They used the constellations for navigation and for timekeeping, but they also watched the sky for omens. A comet, a meteor shower, or an eclipse would have been seen as a powerful portent, a message from the heavens about the future. A celestial event could cause panic in a garrison, or it could boost morale, depending on how it was interpreted by the local soothsayers. The great, silent drama of the cosmos was a constant presence in the lives of the soldiers, a source of both wonder and dread in their lonely vigil. Let's consider the wild plants that grow on the wall today. Many of them are not just weeds. They are plants that have been used for centuries in traditional Chinese medicine. The wall has become a long, linear pharmacy, a repository of wild herbs that are collected by local villagers. This is another of the wall's strange, later-life functions. A place that was once a source of so much death and disease is now a source of healing. It's a quiet, beautiful irony, a testament to nature's ability to turn a monument of conflict into a garden of remedies, another layer in the endless story of the wall's transformation. The story of the wall is also a story of water. In the arid landscape of northern China, water is life. The control of rivers and streams was a major strategic consideration for the wall's builders. They had to ensure that their own garrisons had access to a reliable water supply, while also trying to deny that same water to the enemy. This led to the construction of complex dams, cisterns, and underground channels. The fight for control of the frontier was not just a fight over territory. It was a fight for control over the region's most precious resource. The wall is not just a line of stone. It is part of a massive, ancient water management system. Let's think about the wall's legacy in the global imagination. For people outside of China, the wall has become a kind of shorthand for any massive, ambitious, and slightly crazy undertaking. We talk about building a wall against poverty or disease. The term has entered our language as a metaphor for any great challenge. This is perhaps the wall's most enduring legacy. It has become a universal symbol of humanity's audacious, often hubristic, desire to overcome impossible odds and to impose its will upon the world. It is a story that resonates with us not because it is Chinese, but because it is a story about the fundamental human impulse to build, to divide, and to dream on an epic scale. We must also acknowledge the wall's role as a source of modern myths and conspiracy theories. There are fringe theories that the wall is a giant energy conductor built by ancient aliens, or that its path follows mystical ley lines. These stories, while completely unfounded, are a testament to the wall's power to inspire awe and to make people feel that such a massive structure could not possibly have been built by ordinary humans. These modern myths are just the latest chapter in the wall's long history of being more of an idea than a physical object, a screen onto which people have always projected their own beliefs and fantasies. Imagine growing up as a child in a village in the shadow of the wall. The wall is not a historical monument to you. It is a part of your playground. It is the big, crumbling hill you climb with your friends. It is the place where you hide from your parents. It is a completely normal, everyday part of your landscape. You are not intimidated by its history or its scale. This intimate, childhood relationship with the wall is something that no tourist can ever experience. For the people who live with it every day, the wall is not a symbol. It is a familiar presence, a silent, ancient neighbor that has always been there. The sheer weight of the wall is a secret in itself. The billions of tons of stone and earth that make up the wall have been pressing down on the landscape for centuries. This immense weight has subtly altered the geology of the ground beneath it, compacting the soil and even causing minor shifts in the Earth's crust in some areas. The wall is not just sitting on the landscape, it has become a part of it, a man-made mountain range that has physically merged with the planet. This is the ultimate symbol of its permanence, a structure so massive that it has literally left an indentation on the world. So what is the final, darkest secret of the Great Wall? Perhaps it is this, that the wall worked, not in the way the emperors intended. It did not create a permanent, impenetrable barrier that kept China safe from the outside world. That was always a fantasy. But it did succeed in another, more profound way. It succeeded in creating a powerful, enduring symbol of us versus them. It built a wall in the minds of people, a psychological barrier that has lasted far longer than any of its physical stones. The wall succeeded in teaching a culture to think in terms of walls, a legacy that continues to shape the world in countless ways today. The story of the wall is a story of contradictions. It was built to protect, but its construction destroyed the lives of millions. It was a symbol of strength, but it was born from a place of fear and weakness. It was a line meant to separate peoples, but it created a unique zone of cultural fusion along its length. It was a military failure, but it has become an enduring cultural success. To understand the wall is to embrace these contradictions, to see it not as a simple object with a single purpose, but as a complex and living piece of history that is full of irony, tragedy, and unexpected beauty. The Great Wall is not a single story, but a library of millions of stories. It is the story of the general, the soldier, the farmer, the poet, the wife, the engineer, the smuggler, and the emperor. Each of their lives was a single, unique thread woven into the vast, complex tapestry of the wall's history. Most of those threads are now invisible, lost to the passage of time, but they are still there, embedded in the very structure of the wall. Every stone is a memorial to a forgotten life, every watchtower a monument to 1,000 lonely nights. The pop culture image of the wall is that of a single, unified project, a clear vision executed by a powerful emperor. But the reality we've uncovered is a story of a messy, multi-generational, and often desperate improvisation. It was less like the building of a grand cathedral, and more like a homeowner constantly adding new locks to his door, patching holes in his fence, and still never feeling completely safe. It was a project defined by reaction, not by vision, a sprawling testament to centuries of anxiety. The idea of a single glorious Great Wall is a myth that papers over a much more human and chaotic reality of trial and error. We often think of the wall as ancient, a relic from a distant, almost mythical past. But the sections that are most famous, the brick and stone structures of the Ming Dynasty, are actually younger than many of the great cathedrals of Europe. This is a crucial perspective. The wall is not just a story from the ancient world. It is also a story from the early modern period, a contemporary of the Renaissance and the age of exploration. It is a reminder that while one part of the world was building great ships to cross the oceans, another was pouring its resources into building the greatest land-based fortification ever conceived. The wall's story is also a powerful lesson in the law of unintended consequences. The emperors who built it had a very clear set of goals: defense, control, and taxation. But the wall produced countless results they never intended. It altered the ecosystem. It created new black markets. It unified the very enemies it was meant to divide. And it became a powerful symbol for future generations in ways they could never have imagined. The wall is a monument to the fact that once you build something on this scale, it takes on a life of its own, and its true meaning will be decided not by its builders, but by the endless, unpredictable flow of history. Let's think about silence one last time. For all the stories and all the noise we've discussed, the dominant experience of the wall throughout its history has been one of silence. The silence of the vast, empty landscapes it crosses. The silence of the forgotten laborers buried in its foundations. The silence of the centuries it lay abandoned and neglected. This silence is perhaps the most authentic part of the wall's legacy. It is a silence that invites us to listen closely, to hear the faint echoes of the lost voices, and to contemplate the immense, quiet weight of the history that it carries. So when you see a picture of the Great Wall, try to look beyond the majestic image, see the individual bricks, and remember the exhausted hands that made them. See the steep staircases, and imagine the weary soldiers who patrolled them. See the watchtowers, and think of the lonely men who stared out at the empty horizon, dreaming of home. See the crumbling sections, and remember that failure and decay are a part of every great story. See the wall not as a single, perfect object, but as a vast, imperfect, and deeply human landscape. The story of the Wall challenges our desire for clear narratives and simple heroes. There are no purely good or evil figures in this story. The emperors who ordered the Wall were not just cruel tyrants. They were often men genuinely trying to protect their people from very real threats. The nomads on the other side were not just savage raiders. They were people trying to survive in a harsh environment, often responding to economic pressures created by the empire itself. The story of the Wall is a story told in shades of gray, a reminder that history is rarely a simple tale of right versus wrong. The Wall teaches us that the most impressive things humans build are often monuments to our deepest fears. The pyramids were monuments to the fear of death and being forgotten. The great cathedrals were monuments to the fear of divine judgment. And the Great Wall is a monument to a fear of the unknown, a fear of the other, a fear of the chaos that lies just beyond the fragile borders of our own orderly world. It is the greatest defensive structure ever built, and it is also the world's longest and most elaborate expression of anxiety. Our journey tonight has taken us from the popular myth of a single, glorious wall to a much darker and more complex reality. We've seen that it was not one wall, but many. That it was built not just with stone, but with the lives of countless forgotten people. That its purpose was not just defense, but also imprisonment and control. And that its ultimate legacy is not one of military victory, but of a powerful and enduring idea that has been reshaped by every generation. The romantic image is a simple story, but the truth, as always, is much more interesting. We've walked the battlements with lonely soldiers, we've wept with Meng Jiangnu, and we've felt the despair of the conscripted builder. We have replaced the postcard image with a mosaic of human experiences, a collection of stories that reveal the true cost of this immense undertaking. The Wall is not a story of a stone dragon. It is a story of human hands, human hearts, and human folly. It is a testament to what we can achieve when we are driven by a singular purpose, and a terrifying reminder of the price that is often paid for such grand ambitions. In the end, the Wall stands as a powerful symbol of the tension between permanence and impermanence. The emperors built it to be an eternal boundary, a line on the earth that would last forever. They sought to fix the world in place, to create a permanent solution to a temporary problem. But history is a river, not a rock. It flows around even the greatest obstacles. The Wall, for all its mass and all its length, could not stop the flow of time, the movement of peoples, or the shifting of political power. Its crumbling ruins are a quiet but profound lesson in humility. We began with the idea of the Wall as a symbol of strength, but perhaps its truer meaning is as a symbol of endurance. Not the endurance of stone, but the endurance of the ordinary people whose lives were shaped and broken by it. The endurance of the farmer who continued to work his field in its shadow. The endurance of the woman who waited for a husband who would never return. The endurance of the soldier who kept his lonely vigil year after year. The Wall is their story. A story of quiet, anonymous survival in the face of overwhelming state power. So the next time you hear someone mention the Great Wall, you'll know that the real story is not about what is visible from the moon. It's about what is visible only when you look closely, when you listen to the whispers of history that still echo along its crumbling stones. It is the story of the sticky rice in the mortar, the poems carved into the bricks, the forgotten supply lists, and the ghosts of the millions who paid the price for its construction. The dark secrets of the Great Wall are not hidden. They are simply the human stories that make up its true foundation. The journey from the pop culture myth to the empathetic reality shows us that no historical monument is ever what it seems on the surface. They are all built on a bedrock of forgotten stories, unintended consequences, and human complexities. The Great Wall is perhaps the greatest example of this. It is both more brutal and more fascinating than its legend. It is a story not of a perfect defense, but of a magnificent, tragic, and deeply flawed attempt to control a world that refuses to be controlled. Tonight we've dismantled a myth, We've taken the clean, simple story of the Great Wall and replaced it with a much messier, more human, and ultimately, more meaningful one. We've seen that the wall was not a single object, but a process. Not a solution, but a source of endless new problems. Not just a line of defense, but a vast and complex landscape of human experience. The legend is awe-inspiring, but the reality is where the true, profound, and sleepy history lies. The weight of the stories is far heavier than the weight of the stones. The wall's final irony is that this ultimate symbol of separation has now become a place where people from all over the world come together. Millions of tourists from countless different cultures walk along its battlements every year, sharing a moment of wonder. A structure that was built to enforce a rigid division between us and them has become a shared piece of global heritage, a place of connection. In its old age, the wall has finally and accidentally achieved a kind of peace that it never could in its youth. So as we end our journey, let the image of the wall settle in your mind. Not the perfect, pristine image from a travel brochure, but the real wall. The wall of dust, wind, and ghosts. The wall of corrupt officials and lonely soldiers. The wall that was a failure and a prison and an environmental disaster, and yet, somehow, remains one of the most compelling and moving things that humanity has ever created. Let the complexity of its story be a reminder that the past is never simple and that every great achievement has a hidden cost. We've seen that the romanticized myths of history often serve to hide the messy, uncomfortable truths. They make the past seem simpler, grander, and less human than it really was. But the real stories, the stories of the forgotten people and the unintended consequences, are where the true wonder lies. The story of the Great Wall is not a fairy tale of wise emperors and stone dragons. It is a gritty human story of fear, ambition, and survival on an epic scale. It is a story that should not just inspire awe, but also a deep and profound empathy for the people who lived it. And so, the wall sleeps. It is no longer a frontier, no longer a line of defense. Its battles are now fought against the wind, the rain, and the slow encroachment of time. Its watchtowers are empty, its signal fires are cold. But if you listen carefully, in the quiet of the night, you can still hear the echoes of its long and difficult history. The stories are there, waiting to be heard. A final, silent testament to one of the greatest and most tragic undertakings in the human story. The wall's long watch is over, and now it can finally rest. In the end, the history of the Great Wall teaches us a simple, timeless lesson. If you spend centuries and countless lives building the biggest, most expensive, and most complicated security system in the history of the world, you should probably make sure you don't leave the back door unlocked.